Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight we're settling in with something wonderfully ordinary and surprisingly misunderstood. Fasting. Not in the dramatic, heroic sense. Not as a punishment, not as a trend wrapped in before and after photos, and not as some mystical shortcut whispered about by people who always seem suspiciously energetic before sunrise. Just fasting in the plain biological sense. A stretch of time when the body does not receive food and must quietly begin working with what it already has. It sounds simple, and in many ways it is. But inside that simplicity is a long chain of decisions, adjustments, and small chemical conversations that begin almost the moment a meal ends. Before we ease into all of that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. It feels fitting somehow, because fasting is so much about time. Not just what you eat, but when you stop, how long the pause lasts, and what your body does during that quiet space between meals. And if you find this soothing, helpful, or simply a gentle way to unwind at the end of the day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm little corner reach other people who might enjoy winding down with a bit of biology before sleep. Now get comfortable, let the day loosen its grip a little, and let's begin with the simplest question of all. What does it actually mean to fast? At first glance, fasting can sound more complicated than it really is. In everyday language, it often gets bundled together with dieting, restriction, discipline, health goals, spiritual practice, and all sorts of modern arguments about metabolism. But at the biological level, fasting simply means going without food for a period of time. That is all. The moment you stop eating, a countdown of sorts begins, though not the dramatic kind with sirens and flashing lights. More like a kitchen staff quietly shifting roles after the dinner rush. The trays are being cleared, the burners turned down, the leftovers stored, and the workers in the back begin checking what remains in the pantry. Your body is wonderfully prepared for this. In fact, it expects it. That is the first thing worth saying clearly. The human body did not evolve under the assumption of constant snacking. It did not emerge in a world of cupboards, vending machines, food delivery apps, cereal bars and glove compartments, and the deeply modern belief that being hungry for 20 minutes is some kind of biological emergency. For most of human history, eating was shaped by daylight, labour, weather, seasons, hunting luck, crop cycles, and pure availability. Meals happened, of course, but not with the mechanical regularity of a digital schedule pinned to a refrigerator. There were natural gaps. There were long mornings, delayed evenings, missed opportunities, lean days, and unpredictable stretches when the body had to rely not on incoming calories, but on stored energy. Because of that, fasting is not something alien to human biology. It is not a glitch. It is not the body malfunctioning because lunch is late. It is part of the body's design. We are built not only to eat food, process it and store it, but also to draw on those stores when food is not immediately coming in. That is one of the basic jobs of metabolism. Not just turning food into energy, but managing energy over time. In the most ordinary sense, almost everyone fasts every day. If you eat dinner at 8 p.m. and breakfast at 8 a.m., you have fasted for 12 hours. It does not feel dramatic because you were asleep for much of it, which is perhaps the most elegant fasting strategy ever invented. No motivational speeches required, no need to stare at an empty plate and philosophize. You simply stop eating, go to bed, and let your body carry on with its work in the background. This is one reason the word breakfast is so charming when you think about it literally. It is the meal that breaks the fast. Hidden there in plain sight is the quiet reminder that not eating for a while is the ordinary state between periods of feeding. What changes in modern conversation is not whether fasting exists, but how long it lasts and why a person is doing it. Some people stop eating for 12 hours overnight and think nothing of it. Others intentionally stretch that to 14, 16 or longer for health reasons, weight loss, religious observance, blood sugar management, appetite control or simple routine. Some fast because they are curious, some because they feel better that way, some because life gets busy and they realise at 3 PM that they have accidentally conducted a metabolism experiment. The body, for the most part, responds not to ideology, but to timing and chemistry. It does not care whether a missed meal came with a spreadsheet, a spiritual intention, or a distracted morning meeting. It simply begins adjusting. To understand those adjustments, it helps to remember that the body is always managing 2 broad conditions: the fed state and the fasted state. In the fed state, food is coming in. Glucose rises in the blood. Insulin is released. Nutrients are absorbed. The body begins using some of that energy right away while storing some for later. It is a time of incoming supply. In the fasted state, that incoming supply slows or stops. The body then turns inward. It starts asking a practical question. What do we already have available, and how should we use it? That question alone removes a surprising amount of the mystery. Fasting is not the body going blank. It is not the engine shutting off. It is not your cells looking around helplessly like dinner guests after the restaurant closes early. It is a shift from receiving energy from the outside to managing energy from the inside. First, the body uses what is immediately accessible. Then, depending on how long the fast lasts, it begins drawing from stored forms of fuel. This transition happens in stages. It is controlled by hormones, organ systems, enzymes, and fuel reserves that are there precisely for this purpose. There is something reassuring about that, I think. The body is not fragile in the way modern food culture sometimes suggests. It is responsive. It is dynamic. It is prepared. Of course, that does not mean all fasting is automatically good for all people in all contexts. Bodies differ, health conditions differ, energy needs differ, stress levels differ. A pregnant body, a growing teenage body, an athlete in heavy training, a person with diabetes using medication, someone recovering from illness, someone with a history of disordered eating, and someone simply experimenting with meal timing are not all standing in the same biological place. Fasting is not a moral act. It is a physiological condition, and physiology always lives in context. Still, at the most general level, the body's relationship with fasting is practical rather than panicked. When you eat, your body stores some of that energy in forms it can later use. The liver stores glycogen. Muscles store glycogen for their own use. Fat tissue stores triglycerides. Blood carries nutrients for immediate circulation. Hormones act like messengers telling tissues whether this is a moment for storing, releasing, building, or conserving. Your body is not merely consuming meals one at a time like a machine that only runs with constant refueling. It is budgeting, balancing, saving, releasing, adjusting to the rhythm of intake and pause. This is one reason the early hours of fasting are often far less dramatic than people imagine. If you stop eating after dinner, your body does not leap straight into some cinematic survival mode by midnight. It is still digesting, absorbing, regulating, clearing, storing, and redistributing. Nutrients from the last meal may still be moving through the bloodstream. Insulin may still be elevated for a while. The digestive tract is winding down gradually, not slamming shut like a shopkeeper pulling down a metal door. The body shifts its gears in sequence. That sequence matters because many of the grand claims people make about fasting collapse under the weight of timing. Someone might say fasting burns fat, which can be true, but not every moment of every fast is the same. Someone else might say fasting boosts mental clarity, which some people do feel, but not instantly, not always, and not without variation. Another person might insist fasting puts the body under stress, which is also true in one sense, because it is a demand the body must adapt to. But stress in biology is not automatically bad. Exercise is stress. Cold is stress. Lack of sleep is stress. Infection is stress. A deadline is stress. The important question is not whether something is stress, but what kind, how much, for how long, in whom, and with what outcome. The body, after all, is constantly negotiating demands. It likes stability, but it also depends on flexibility. A healthy metabolism is not a metabolism that only functions under one perfect condition. It is a metabolism that can handle feeding and fasting, rest and activity, warmth and cold, abundance and pause. It can take in energy, and it can use stored energy. It can build, and it can break down. That ability to switch between states is part of metabolic health itself. There is another common misunderstanding worth clearing gently from the table. Fasting is not the same thing as starvation. These words are often used loosely, especially by people who become deeply concerned if you mention skipping breakfast, as though you have announced plans to wander into the wilderness with only a cucumber and unresolved emotional issues. But biologically, fasting and starvation are not the same. Fasting is a temporary absence of food, often within a controlled or limited window, during which the body uses stored fuel in expected ways. Starvation is prolonged energy deprivation severe enough that the body's reserves become dangerously depleted, and normal function begins breaking down in a harmful, unsustainable way. The distinction matters. One is a physiological state the body is built to tolerate for some time. The other is a crisis. That said, even ordinary fasting is felt differently by different people. One person may glide through it with steady energy and barely notice the hours. Another may become irritable, shaky, preoccupied with toast, and suddenly aware that other human beings have been eating bread in provocative ways for centuries. Some of this variation comes down to habits. If a person is used to eating frequently, the first attempts at fasting may feel uncomfortable, simply because the body and brain are accustomed to a different rhythm. Some of it comes down to sleep, stress, blood sugar regulation, previous meals, caffeine, activity, hormones, and individual sensitivity. Hunger is not just an empty stomach. It is an orchestrated experience involving the brain, gut, hormones, memory, routine, smell, time of day, and expectation. Expectation in particular is wonderfully powerful. If you always eat lunch at noon, you may begin feeling hungry close to noon even if your body has plenty of stored energy available. That does not mean the hunger is fake. It means biology is predictive. The body learns rhythms. The brain anticipates reward. Digestive processes begin preparing. Hormonal signals rise around expected meal times. Hunger can arrive like a habitual knock at the door, not because the house is empty, but because someone usually shows up around then with groceries. This makes fasting not just a metabolic event, but a psychological one as well. It changes your relationship to appetite, routine, and time. Hours that normally slide by unnoticed can become oddly vivid when you are aware that you are not eating. You start noticing how often food structures the day. Morning coffee becomes a question. Midday becomes a test. Evening becomes either easy or strangely theatrical, depending on your kitchen and your emotional attachment to toast. People often imagine fasting as merely not eating, but in practice it can reveal how social, emotional, and patterned eating really is. There is also the quiet fact that many of us eat for reasons that have little to do with immediate energy need. We eat because it is lunchtime, because someone offered, because food is there, because it smells good, because work was annoying, because it is a film night, because it is raining, because it is sunny, because we deserve a treat, because the treat exists. None of this is wrong. Eating is not meant to be stripped of pleasure or culture or comfort. But fasting, even briefly, can make visible the many layers of eating that sit on top of biology. Beneath those layers, the body continues doing its practical work, and that work is impressively coordinated. The liver becomes especially important. It helps maintain blood glucose in the early phases after food stops coming in. Fat cells begin playing a larger role over time. Hormones such as insulin begin to fall, while others involved in mobilizing stored fuel become more active. The brain remains a demanding organ, of course. It does not politely lower its energy bill just because you skipped a meal. It still needs fuel. Much of fasting physiology is the body making sure that fuel remains available. first through one pathway, later through another, in a sequence that protects function while adapting to the pause in food intake. This is why fasting is better understood as a transition than a single state. People often speak about it as though there is a clear on-off switch. Fed, fasted, done. But the body is more nuanced than that. There are hours when you're no longer digesting much of the last meal, but still relying largely on circulating and stored carbohydrate. There are later hours when fuel use begins shifting. There are later stages when ketone production rises more noticeably. Timing, again, matters. What happens at 10 hours is not identical to what happens at 20. What happens after a mixed evening meal is not identical to what happens after a day of heavy exercise followed by a light dinner. Biology is gloriously unwilling to fit into neat slogans. Even the word "does" in the phrase "what fasting actually does to your body" deserves some patience. Fasting does not act on the body like a single tool performing one clean task. It changes the conditions under which the body operates, and the body responds with many adjustments at once. Some are about fuel use, some are about hormones, some are about digestion, getting a rest from incoming work. Some are about appetite signals. Some may affect inflammation, cellular maintenance, or insulin sensitivity depending on the pattern, duration and context. It is less like pressing one button and more like changing the weather in a room. Different systems respond in different ways. That is part of what makes fasting so interesting, and also so easy to oversimplify. It is simple enough to describe in one sentence, and complicated enough to fill entire fields of study. It sits at the crossroads of metabolism, endocrinology, neuroscience, behavior, and culture. A person can experience it as routine, challenge, relief, discipline, annoyance, clarity, distraction, empowerment, or just an extended period of thinking, rather a lot about soup. Meanwhile, inside the body, a much quieter story is unfolding. Glucose is being regulated, stores are being checked, hormones are adjusting their tone, cells are shifting fuel preference. The body is moving from one mode to another with the sort of low-key competence that rarely gets enough admiration. And perhaps that is the most useful place to begin this journey. Not with grand claims, but with a respect for the body's competence. Fasting is not magic. It is not a cheat code. It is not a guarantee. It is not automatically cleansing, damaging, healing, or wise. It is a condition the body knows how to navigate, sometimes beneficial, sometimes neutral, sometimes unhelpful, depending on the person and the pattern, but always biological, not mystical, not moral, not proof of virtue. Just a pause in eating during which the body begins using what it has already stored and reorganizing how it manages energy. That pause, as we'll see, has stages. At first, the body leans on what is close at hand. The recent meal still casts a shadow. Blood nutrients are still being sorted. Insulin gradually eases. The liver begins taking on more of the burden of maintaining stable energy in the bloodstream. For a while, the body is living on the leftovers of the fed state, which sounds less glamorous than it is, but is really a sign of excellent planning. You do not need to refill the pantry every hour because the pantry exists for a reason. Later, if the fasting window continues, the body begins changing how it meets its needs. It shifts from immediate fuel towards stored fuel. It moves away from relying so heavily on incoming glucose and begins increasing access to internal energy reserves. That turning point is one of the most discussed parts of fasting, and for good reason. It is where many of the more noticeable metabolic changes begin to gather momentum. But that is getting a little ahead of our quiet evening together. For now, it is enough to rest with the opening idea. Fasting means not eating for a period of time. The body responds not with confusion but with adaptation. It moves from feeding mode toward internal fuel management. It relies first on what is available, then on what is stored. It is prepared for this. It has always been prepared for this. The pause is not emptiness. It is activity of another kind. And in the first hours without food, some of the most important changes are already beginning, even if they are still gentle enough to pass unnoticed from the outside. The first hours without food are far less dramatic than people often imagine. If you stop eating after dinner and settle into your evening, your body does not suddenly throw open all the emergency cupboards, sound a metabolic alarm, and begin behaving as though civilization has ended because no one handed it a cracker at 10 p.m. Quite the opposite. In those early hours, the body is still working with what is already there. It is still sorting, storing, circulating, releasing, and managing the energy from your last meal with a kind of quiet competence that rarely gets the credit it deserves. The real story of early fasting is not about deprivation. It is about transition. It is about how the body moves from incoming fuel to already available fuel, gradually, efficiently, and in a sequence that keeps you functioning with remarkable steadiness. To understand that, it helps to picture the body not as a machine that needs constant refueling every few minutes, but more like a well-run household after a grocery delivery. Food has arrived. Some of it is being used immediately. Some of it is being unpacked and put away. Some of it is going into the fridge for later. Some is being frozen. And everyone in the house seems to know their job without needing a dramatic staff meeting. In the hours after a meal, your digestive system is still breaking food down. Nutrients are being absorbed through the intestines. Glucose is entering the bloodstream. Amino acids from protein are circulating. Fat from the meal is being packaged and transported. Hormones are responding. The body is not yet in some deep fasted state. It is still in active conversation with the food you already ate. This is one of the reasons the first stage of fasting is often misunderstood. People hear the word fasting and imagine an empty system. But for quite a while after eating, the system is anything but empty. It is busy. Your stomach may still be releasing food gradually into the small intestine. Your intestines are still absorbing nutrients. Your liver is processing them. Your pancreas is responding. Your blood is carrying energy to tissues that need it. And tissues all over the body are making small practical decisions based on what is available. Use this now. Store this for later. Convert this into something else. Keep blood sugar steady. Keep the brain supplied. Keep muscles ready. Keep the whole operation moving smoothly. One of the central players in this period is insulin, which tends to rise after eating, especially when a meal contains carbohydrate. Insulin is often talked about in modern culture as though it was some sort of metabolic villain lurking behind every slice of bread with a clipboard and a bad attitude. But insulin is doing a necessary job. It helps move glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. It signals that energy is available. It tells tissues that this is a time for using and storing incoming nutrients. In the first hours after a meal, insulin helps coordinate the fed state. Glucose from digestion can be used right away by many cells. Some of it can be stored as glycogen, especially in the liver and muscles. Some may contribute to fat storage if energy intake exceeds immediate needs. Insulin is not being malicious. It is being organized. As the hours pass and no new food arrives, insulin does not remain elevated forever. It begins to fall. That fall is one of the important quiet shifts that marks the body's move away from the fed state. But it does not drop like a stone in theatrical slow motion while ominous music plays. It eases downward as digestion winds down, and the flow of fresh nutrients into the blood becomes smaller. This change matters because when insulin falls, the body becomes less focused on storing incoming energy and more open to releasing stored energy. That shift is not yet the full turning point of fasting, but it is the beginning of the beginning. The body is gently taking its foot off one pedal and preparing to press the other. During these first hours, blood glucose is usually kept within a fairly narrow range, especially in a healthy body. That stability is one of the great hidden achievements of metabolism. The brain depends heavily on glucose, and many tissues also rely on it. You cannot have blood sugar swinging wildly every time you delay a meal by an hour or two. So the body uses several overlapping systems to keep things steady. At first, the glucose in your bloodstream and the nutrients still being absorbed from the digestive tract do much of the work. But as the meal fades into the background, the liver becomes increasingly important. The liver is one of those organs that feels underappreciated until you start paying attention to what it actually does, at which point it begins to seem less like an organ and more like a very patient logistics manager that has been quietly running half the city. During the early hours without food, the liver helps maintain blood glucose by releasing some of the glycogen it has stored. Glycogen is a storage form of glucose, rather like the body's short-term carbohydrate reserve. It is not endless, but it is useful. In the fed state, some of the glucose from a meal is stored as glycogen. In the early fasted state, some of that glycogen is broken back down into glucose and released into the blood as needed. It is an elegant arrangement. Save when food is coming in. Release when it is not. This is why the first hours without food are not usually a crisis. Your body has a buffer. It has reserves close at hand. The liver is not inventing energy from nowhere, nor is it waiting helplessly for breakfast like a commuter stranded on an empty platform. It is managing what was already stored. And because this process is ongoing behind the scenes, most people do not feel some sudden biological collapse between meals. They may feel hungry, of course, but hunger is not the same thing as immediate fuel failure. The body can have energy available even while the brain begins making persuasive speeches about sandwiches. That distinction matters. Hunger is a signal, not a simple meter reading. It reflects hormones, habits, learned meal times, stomach stretching, blood sugar patterns, emotional state, sleep, stress, sensory cues, and expectation. You can have plenty of stored energy and still feel hungry because it is noon, and your brain has become quite attached to the ritual of lunch. Equally, you can be temporarily distracted, excited, or stressed and forget to eat even though your body would quite like some input. The early hours without food are shaped not only by fuel physiology, but also by the way the brain interprets the situation. One of the hormones involved in that interpretation is ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone. Ghrelin tends to rise before expected meals and fall after eating. What is interesting is that ghrelin does not simply climb upward forever in a straight line the longer you go without food, like an increasingly dramatic violin soundtrack. It often comes in waves. People who begin fasting sometimes notice this clearly. Hunger arrives, feels quite convincing for a while, and then fades again even though they still have not eaten. That can seem strange at first, but it makes sense. Hunger signals are rhythmic. They are influenced by routine. The body is partly predicting meals, not merely reacting to absolute depletion. That rhythmic quality is one reason the early hours can feel so different from person to person. If someone usually eats every few hours, the first stretch without food may feel louder because the usual signals are still arriving on schedule. If someone is used to longer gaps between meals, those same hours may feel surprisingly ordinary. The body learns patterns. It does not treat every missed snack like a fresh philosophical crisis. It adapts to routine with a practicality that is both helpful and occasionally inconvenient when you're trying to change your habits. Meanwhile, other tissues are making their own adjustments. Muscle, for instance, has glycogen too, but muscle glycogen is generally stored for the muscle's own use, especially during activity. It is not shared freely with the rest of the body in the way liver glycogen supports blood glucose. This makes the liver particularly central in the first hours of fasting, especially for maintaining the brain supply. The muscles continue using energy according to what you are doing. If you are resting, their demands are modest. If you are active, they draw more heavily on their available fuel sources. A brisk walk after dinner, a restless night, a long shift at work, or a morning workout can all shape what the first hours without food feel like because they affect energy use and fuel turnover. The brain, as ever, remains a demanding tenant. It is not especially interested in your meal timing philosophies. It would simply like to be supplied adequately, thank you very much, so it can continue running thoughts, memory, attention, mood, and the occasional unnecessary replay of something awkward you said in 2017. In the first hours without food, the brain is still relying heavily on glucose. Later, in a longer fast, other fuel sources begin to matter more, but early on the body is working to keep glucose available, largely through the processes already set in motion by your last meal and by liver glycogen release. This is why it can be helpful to think of early fasting not as nothing happening, but as the body finishing one phase before fully entering another. The digestive tract is winding down, absorption is tapering, hormones are shifting, the liver is stepping in more actively. Tissues are moving from external supply to internal management. It is not abrupt. The fed state does not simply vanish at the exact moment you put down your fork. It fades. It leaves behind stored fuel, circulating nutrients, hormonal signals, and metabolic instructions that continue shaping the next several hours. There is something almost domestic about it. The meal is over, but the washing up is still being done. Counters are being wiped. Leftovers are being labelled. Tomorrow's lunch is quietly going into the fridge. The body likes not just eating, but planning. It likes continuity. And so the early hours without food are really an extension of the meal that came before them. They are the period in which the body uses what is already on hand before making larger shifts. This also explains why the composition of your previous meal can shape those first hours quite a bit. A meal rich in carbohydrate may produce a different post-meal glucose and insulin response than a meal higher in fat and protein. A very large meal may linger longer in digestion than a small one. Fibre slows gastric emptying and can change the pace at which nutrients enter the bloodstream. Alcohol can interfere with some aspects of metabolic regulation. A late evening dessert may influence blood sugar and hunger differently than a simple dinner eaten several hours before sleep. The early fasted state is not one identical experience repeated endlessly. It is partly the echo of what came before. Sleep adds another layer, and perhaps the most merciful one. Much of ordinary daily fasting happens overnight, when you are unconscious and therefore less likely to sit at the edge of the bed negotiating with a piece of toast. During sleep, the body continues all of this quiet regulation. Liver glycogen helps maintain blood glucose. Hormones shift according to circadian rhythms as well as feeding state. Growth hormone tends to rise during sleep and has its own effects on fuel metabolism and tissue maintenance. The digestive system gets a break from incoming meals. That overnight pause is not a dramatic detox or some magical reset button, but it is a normal period during which the body can operate without constant incoming nutrients. In a sense, sleep makes fasting feel natural by hiding most of the awkward bits. Morning, of course, is where people begin interpreting the experience. Some wake up feeling perfectly fine and may not be hungry right away. Others wake up ravenous, as though their body has spent the night drafting a formal complaint. Both are understandable. Morning appetite varies widely. Cortisol, sleep quality, previous food intake, meal timing, and individual habit all matter. Some people are natural breakfast eaters. Others do not feel truly hungry until later. The important point is that the first hours without food do not automatically dictate one emotional experience. The body is doing its work regardless, but your awareness of that work may be mild, loud, calm, or rather grumpy. One reason fasting became surrounded by so much mythology is that internal metabolic processes are easy to romanticize when you cannot see them. If a person skips breakfast and feels alert, they may imagine some hidden, ancient switch has been activated, and their ancestors are applauding from across evolutionary time. If another person skips breakfast and becomes irritable by 10 a.m., they may conclude fasting is a terrible idea, invented by people who enjoy suffering recreationally. In truth, the early hours are simply a period of metabolic carryover and adjustment. The body is using what is already there. Sometimes that feels smooth, sometimes it feels distracting. Sometimes it depends mostly on whether you slept badly and had too much coffee. Coffee, speaking of which, deserves an honourable mention because it complicates many people's early fasting experience in a way that is both common and deeply human. Caffeine can suppress appetite in some people, sharpen alertness, and make the first hours feel easier. It can also increase jitters, stomach discomfort, or the sense that you are operating on borrowed enthusiasm and questionable judgment. Coffee without food affects different people differently. For some, it is a simple pleasure. For others, it is a shortcut to wondering why their heartbeat seems personally offended. Again, context matters. The body is never responding to fasting alone in a vacuum. It is responding to the whole scene. At the hormonal level, the first hours without food involve more than insulin and ghrelin. Glycogen also plays a role. Often described as a kind of counterbalance to insulin, glycogen helps signal the liver to release stored glucose. When insulin falls and glycogen rises nisbiyan, the body shifts more clearly toward maintaining blood glucose from internal stores rather than from incoming food. This is not a war between hormones so much as a coordinated shift in management style. The body is not confused about whether it has eaten. It knows perfectly well. It is simply adjusting policy. Adrenaline and noradrenaline can also influence how fasting feels, particularly as time goes on. These hormones are involved in alertness, fuel mobilization, and stress response. In the early stage, the effects may be subtle, but some people notice that not eating for a while does not necessarily make them sluggish. Sometimes they feel more awake. Part of that can be psychological. Part of it can be relief from post-meal heaviness. Part of it may reflect hormonal changes that help keep the body alert enough to function, while food is not currently arriving. Evolutionarily, this makes a great deal of sense. It would not be especially helpful if every stretch without food immediately made an organism too sleepy to seek any. That said, there is a difference between supported alertness and overstrain. If fasting is combined with poor sleep, high stress, heavy exertion, illness, or underlying blood sugar problems, the first hours can feel rougher. A healthy body can usually manage a routine overnight fast and a delayed meal without much trouble. But not all bodies are in the same condition, and not all days are the same. Biology is adaptable, but it is not identical from one situation to the next. It is always listening to the full context. There is also the digestive side of things, which gets surprisingly little attention in popular talk about fasting. The first hours without food are not only about fuel, they are also a period in which the digestive tract is no longer being asked to process new material. The stomach empties, the intestine clears what remains, various digestive secretions taper. The gut continues its own rhythmic activity. There is evidence that periods between meals may support certain cleaning waves in the digestive tract, called the migrating motor complex, which helps sweep residual material through the system between feedings. It is not glamorous, but then many of the body's most useful processes are not. No one writes epic poems about gastrointestinal housekeeping, and yet it quietly keeps the place functional. A pause from eating can therefore feel physically calming to some people, especially if they are used to constant grazing or very heavy meals. To others, it may feel uncomfortable at first, particularly if stomach sensations have become strongly tied to meal timing. Sometimes what people interpret as dangerous hunger is simply the body noticing that the usual digestive schedule has shifted. The stomach may contract, ghrelin may rise, the mind may become suddenly aware that someone somewhere is definitely eating buttered toast and getting away with it. Yet beneath that awareness, the body is still functioning on available reserves. This is why the phrase, "the body uses what's already there," is such a useful anchor. It keeps us grounded. In the early hours, the body is not yet relying heavily on deeper long-term strategies. It is using the meal you already ate, the glucose already circulating, the glycogen already stored, the hormonal systems already designed for exactly this kind of transition. It is using what is present before needing to shift more substantially into the next phase. And that next phase does come. Liver glycogen is useful, but it is not infinite. The body can maintain this early strategy only for so long before it begins leaning more noticeably on other fuel reserves. As insulin continues to fall and the fasting window lengthens, the metabolic picture changes. The body begins moving more decisively away from immediate carbohydrate supply and toward a different balance of fuel use. That shift does not happen in the first quiet stretch all at once, but the groundwork is being laid here in these very hours. The liver is already active, hormones are already adjusting, appetite signals are already arriving in waves. The body is already proving that a pause in eating is not a void but a planned interval. So when people ask what happens in the first hours without food, The answer is both simpler and more interesting than they might expect. The body keeps going. Digestion tapers but does not vanish instantly. Insulin begins to fall. The liver starts releasing stored glucose. Hunger comes and goes in pulses. The brain stays supplied. Muscles continue according to demand. Hormones shift from storage mode toward access mode. The digestive system catches its breath. And all of it happens with such quiet steadiness that, unless you go looking for it, you might miss the elegance entirely. Still, that elegance is only the beginning. Because after those early hours, another question begins to matter. If the body cannot rely forever on recent food and liver glycogen alone, what exactly happens when that short-term carbohydrate buffer starts to thin and the metabolism must become more creative with its energy supply? One of the easiest ways to misunderstand fasting is to imagine that the body simply goes from fed to unfed in one clean movement, like switching off a lamp. Meal finished, fork down, lights out. Now the body must somehow cope without fuel, but that is not how it works at all. The body is much more prepared, much more layered, and much more practical than that. In the early stretch without food, it does not suddenly run on nothing. It runs on sugar that was already there, sugar that is still circulating, and sugar that has been neatly packed away for later use. This is the sugar shift, the body's early fuel strategy, and it is one of the most important reasons you do not collapse into a dramatic Victorian faint every time breakfast is delayed. At the centre of this story are two closely related players, glucose and glycogen. Glucose is the simple sugar that circulates in your blood and supplies energy to many cells throughout the body. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose, a packed reserve made of many glucose molecules linked together. If glucose is the cash in your wallet, glycogen is money kept in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. It is still yours, still usable, but tucked away until needed. The body likes this arrangement because it solves a basic problem. You need a steady supply of fuel, especially for organs like the brain, but you do not eat continuously, so the body stores some of the energy from meals in a form it can quickly access later. This system is not flashy, but it is elegant. After you eat, especially after a meal containing carbohydrate, glucose rises in the blood as digestion breaks food down and the intestine absorbs it. Some of that glucose is used immediately. Cells all over the body take it in to support their own work. The brain uses a great deal of it. Muscles can use it. Other tissues use it according to their needs. At the same time, some of that incoming glucose is stored for later. The liver stores glycogen, and muscles store glycogen too. These two storage sites matter a great deal, but they do not serve exactly the same purpose, and that difference becomes especially important during fasting. The liver is the body's great manager of blood glucose. It stores glycogen partly so it can later break it down and release glucose back into the bloodstream when no new food is arriving. That makes liver glycogen central to the early fasting state. Muscle glycogen, by contrast, is mostly kept for local use. A muscle can break down its own glycogen when it needs energy, especially during movement or exercise, but it does not generously hand that glucose back to the rest of the body in the same direct way. Muscle is helpful, but it is not a charity. The liver, on the other hand, behaves much more like a public utility, keeping the blood supplied for the sake of the whole system. This is why the sugar shift begins in such a calm and orderly way. In the hours after eating, the body is still using glucose from the meal. Digestion may still be underway. Nutrients are still being absorbed. Insulin has risen to help tissues take up glucose and to encourage storage while food is abundant. Then, as the meal fades into the metabolic background and fewer nutrients are arriving from the gut, insulin begins to fall. That fall matters because it changes the body's priorities. When insulin is higher, the body is more focused on storing and using incoming fuel. When insulin drops, the body becomes more willing to release stored fuel. This is where the liver begins stepping forward more actively, taking glycogen from its shelves and turning it back into usable glucose. It is worth pausing here because this part of fasting is both simple and underrated. The body is not yet in some grand fat-burning epic. It is not performing a mystical transformation under moonlight while your digestive system chants quietly in the background. It is doing something much more sensible. It is using the short-term carbohydrate reserve it deliberately stored earlier. That is the whole point of glycogen. It is a bridge. It allows the body to move from one meal to the next without chaos. It allows overnight fasting to happen routinely. It allows you to wake up in the morning with a functioning brain rather than needing emergency spoonfuls of rice at 3 a.m. The brain, of course, is one of the main reasons this system matters. The brain is a demanding organ. Although it makes up only a small fraction of body weight, it uses a substantial share of the body's energy. In the ordinary fed and early fasted state, it relies heavily on glucose. Later in longer fasts, the brain can use more ketones. But in the early stage, glucose remains crucial. This means the body must guard blood sugar carefully. It cannot allow the level to drift aimlessly just because breakfast has not yet happened. So the liver helps maintain a stable range, releasing glucose as needed from glycogen stores. It does this so smoothly that most people never notice the work being done unless something disrupts the system. That smoothness is one of the quiet miracles of metabolism. You go to sleep. You do not eat for hours. You wake up perhaps thinking about coffee, perhaps thinking about nothing at all, and yet your brain is still supplied. Your blood sugar is still being regulated and your organs are still functioning. None of that happens by accident. It happens because the body planned ahead. It stored energy during the fed state and begins releasing it during the fasted state in a controlled way. The sugar shift is not the body improvising under pressure. It is the body carrying out a prepared strategy. The amount of glycogen available is not endless, though. That is important. Glycogen is a short-term storage system, not a vast warehouse that can fuel the body indefinitely. The liver stores only a limited amount. Muscles store more in total across the body, but again that is mostly for their own use. So in the first part of fasting, the body leans heavily on liver glycogen to support blood glucose, but that support has a time limit, not a perfectly fixed one, because it depends on previous meals, body size, activity level, metabolic health, and other factors, but a limit nonetheless. The sugar shift is an early strategy, not the final one. It buys time, it maintains stability, it handles the opening stretch of the fast while the body prepares for what comes next. This is why the hours after eating are not all metabolically identical. There is a gradual progression. At first, glucose from the meal still contributes significantly. Then, as absorption tapers, liver glycogen becomes increasingly important. Eventually, as glycogen stores diminish, the body begins shifting more strongly toward other fuel sources. But we are not fully there yet. In this stage, the central task is still maintaining glucose and using glycogen wisely. It is a carbohydrate-centered strategy, carefully managed and surprisingly effective. One thing that complicates people's understanding of this stage is that they often confuse hunger with fuel shortage. Those two are related, but they are not identical. You can feel hungry while still having plenty of glycogen available. You can feel perfectly fine while your liver is already doing quite a lot of work in the background. Hunger is influenced by blood sugar, yes, but also by hormones like ghrelin, by habit, by time of day, by the smell of food, by expectation, by sleep, by stress, and by all the wonderfully inconvenient psychological features of being human. The body may have enough glucose support underway while the mind begins making emotional arguments about toast. This does not mean the hunger is imaginary. It simply means that hunger is part signal, part anticipation, part physiology, and part learned routine. Routine really matters here. If you always eat breakfast at a certain hour, your body may begin preparing for it before food even arrives. Hormones rise, appetite increases, digestive readiness changes. If you then skip breakfast, hunger may show up right on time even though your liver is still managing blood glucose just fine. The body has learned the pattern and is responding to the expected meal. Over time, these patterns can change, which is one reason people who begin fasting intentionally often report that the morning hunger they felt at first becomes less intense after a while. Their fuel physiology adapts, certainly, but so do their rhythms and expectations. The previous day's food intake also shapes the sugar shift more than many people realise. If you ate a very carbohydrate-rich dinner, liver glycogen may be more topped up than if you ate very little. If you exercised hard in the evening, especially endurance or high-intensity work, glycogen stores may be lower if you went to bed late after snacking all night. The timing and shape of the overnight fast are different from those of an early dinner followed by sleep. If you drank alcohol, the liver's priorities may be altered, because alcohol metabolism takes precedence in important ways. The early fasting state, then, is not one universal template. It is a common strategy shaped by the conditions that came just before it. Still, the basic pattern holds. Glucose must be kept available. Glycogen provides the first reserve. The liver helps bridge the gap between meals. This arrangement says something important about how the body understands time. It expects intervals. It expects that food will not always be arriving. It builds systems around pauses. In modern life, where eating is often possible at almost any hour, it is easy to forget that the body evolved in a world where meal timing was not always neat and regular. Glycogen is one of the clearest signs that the body is built for flexibility. It stores when food is present so it can release when food is absent. It does not treat every gap as a failure. It treats gaps as part of the design. The hormones that regulate this design deserve some attention too. Insulin, as mentioned, falls after the fed state recedes. Glucagon tends to rise in relative importance. Glucagon is often described as working in opposition to insulin, though that can sound a bit too theatrical for what is really a coordinated system. Insulin generally helps store and use incoming nutrients after eating. Glucagon helps support blood glucose when food is not arriving, especially by signalling the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose. Together, these hormones help the body move between feeding and fasting. They are less like enemies in a metabolic boxing match and more like managers taking different shifts. Other hormones influence this stage too. Stress hormones such as adrenaline and noradrenaline can promote glycogen breakdown and fuel mobilization when needed. Cortisol also plays a role in broader energy regulation, especially across the daily rhythm. The body is never running on one signal alone. It is integrating many messages at once: time of day, recent food, activity, stress, sleep, temperature, and internal fuel status. The sugar shift is therefore not just a matter of glycogen being mechanically emptied. It is a hormonally coordinated transition. The body is reading the whole room, not just counting the minutes since dinner. If you exercise during this stage, things can feel quite different. Activity increases energy demand, and the body must decide quickly how to meet that demand. Muscles can use their own glycogen, especially during more intense work. Blood glucose may also be used. The liver may increase glucose output to help maintain the level in the bloodstream as exercise continues. This means that a morning workout in a fasted state does not place you in a magical separate universe where all rules vanish and the body becomes enlightened. It simply increases the demand on the existing fuel system. Glycogen becomes more relevant, not less. The body still begins with what it already has. The difference is that it may use those reserves faster. This helps explain why some people feel perfectly good exercising before breakfast, while others feel flat, weak, or irritable. It depends on their glycogen status, the type and intensity of exercise, their adaptation to training, their sleep, their overall nutrition, and individual differences in fuel handling. A calm walk before breakfast is very different from a hard cycling session or a long run. The body's early fuel strategy can support a good deal, but it is not infinite, and demand changes everything. It is one thing to keep the brain supplied while you read emails and consider making tea. It is another to fuel repeated sprints while breakfast remains theoretical. There is also a subtle emotional side to this phase that people often notice before they understand it. Some mornings without food feel sharp and clear. Others feel foggy. Some people enjoy the steady simplicity of not eating right away. Others become preoccupied with food almost immediately. Part of this is psychological, but part of it is the quality of the glucose support itself. and how comfortable the person's body is with relying on stored carbohydrate in the early day. A person with more stable metabolic regulation may slide through this phase easily. Someone with more pronounced swings in blood sugar or more dependence on frequent carbohydrate intake may find the sugar shift bumpier. This is not a matter of virtue. It is physiology, and physiology rarely cares about motivational slogans. It is also worth noting that glycogen is stored with water. This means that shifts in glycogen status can affect body water balance to some extent. When glycogen is stored, water accompanies it. When glycogen is broken down and used, some of that associated water is released. This is one reason people sometimes lose weight quickly when they change eating patterns, reduce carbohydrate intake, or begin fasting routines. Not all of that early weight change is fat. Some of it reflects glycogen use and water shifts. The bathroom scale, as usual, enjoys presenting a complex biological story as one suspiciously simple number. It is doing its best, but it is not a philosopher. The body's use of glycogen in early fasting also tells us something about why meal timing can feel so powerful. People sometimes speak as if the first skipped meal already places the body in a fully different metabolic state. But what is really happening at first is more modest and more structured. You're moving through the body's short-term reserve phase. The liver is compensating. Blood glucose is being maintained. The body is working with its carbohydrate buffer. This is important, certainly, but it is not yet the deeper shift that comes when glycogen begins to run low and other strategies become more prominent. If anything, this stage is the body showing just how well it can buffer change before needing to make larger adaptations. That buffering capacity is one of the reasons ordinary daily fasting is possible at all. Imagine if the body had no glycogen system. Every gap between meals would be far more disruptive. Blood sugar would become much harder to regulate. The pressure to eat constantly would be much stronger. Sleep itself would be much more difficult to sustain. Glycogen makes ordinary life workable. It turns meals into intervals rather than emergencies. It allows your metabolism to stretch across time in a controlled way. There is something deeply reassuring in that. The body expects pauses. It is stocked for them. Of course, glycogen cannot solve everything forever. Liver glycogen stores fall as the fast continues. The precise timing varies, but the general truth remains. The early fuel strategy has a horizon. As that horizon approaches, the body must begin relying more on different sources of energy. Fat tissue becomes increasingly important. The liver begins producing more ketones. Fuel use shifts. Hormonal tone continues to change. But before all that takes center stage, glycogen carries much of the opening act. It keeps glucose available. It steadies the transition. It buys time for the metabolism to move from one world into the next. There is something almost charming about how plain-spoken this strategy is. When food stops coming in, the body does not immediately become philosophical. It does not hold a symposium on ancestral resilience. It checks the pantry. It opens the glucose drawer. It asks the liver to do its job. It draws on the reserves it saved earlier. It keeps the lights on. For all the cultural noise around fasting, this part remains beautifully practical. Use what is already there. Use it steadily. Use it wisely. Then, when that supply begins to thin, change the plan. And that change is the next important step. Because once the short-term sugar reserve is no longer enough on its own, the body reaches a turning point. It begins shifting more decisively away from relying so heavily on glycogen and toward tapping into stored fat as a major fuel source. That is where the early carbohydrate strategy gives way to something broader, and where fasting starts to look metabolically different from simply going a little while without a snack. There comes a point in fasting when the body can no longer rely quite so comfortably on the strategy it began with. The first hours are mostly about using what is close at hand. Glucose from the last meal still lingers for a while. Liver glycogen steps in to help maintain blood sugar. The whole system remains, in a sense, carbohydrate-led. But that arrangement cannot continue indefinitely, because glycogen is a short-term reserve. It is useful, efficient, and absolutely essential, but it is not a bottomless vault. So as the fasting window lengthens, the body reaches a turning point. It does not happen with a sudden click or a dramatic sensation in the chest, as though some internal lever has been thrown by a very serious-looking hormone. It happens gradually, quietly. The body begins to change its energy source. This turning point is one of the most talked about parts of fasting, and also one of the most misunderstood. People often imagine it kind of metabolic ceremony. One moment you're running on sugar, the next you have entered a bold new realm where fat becomes fuel. Ketones begin marching in formation, and your cells all nod approvingly at one another in the glow of ancestral wisdom. Real physiology, as usual, is less theatrical and much more interesting. The body does not switch from one fuel to another all at once. It changes the balance. It shifts proportion. It begins relying less on one source and more on another. The transition is real, but it is not absolute. Fuel use in the body is rarely a matter of one thing only. It is a matter of emphasis. To understand why this turning point happens, it helps to remember the basic challenge of fasting. The body must continue functioning without new food coming in. Some organs, especially the brain, still need a steady energy supply. Blood glucose must still be managed. Muscles may still be active. Cells all over the body are still working, repairing, signalling, transporting, maintaining. None of that pauses politely just because breakfast was skipped or lunch has become a slightly philosophical concept. The body must keep meeting its energy needs. At first, it does that mainly through glycogen in the tail end of the fed state, but as liver glycogen begins to thin, the body has to broaden its strategy. That is the turning point. The metabolism starts reaching more decisively into stored fat. Fat is, in many ways, the body's long-term fuel reserve. If glycogen is money in the wallet, fat is the savings account. It is a much larger store of energy, far more abundant and specifically useful when food is not immediately available. This is not an accident. Human beings evolved with the need to store energy when food was plentiful and draw on it when it was not. Fat tissue is one of the clearest signs that the body thinks in time. It is planning for intervals. It is preparing for gaps. It is building continuity between moments of eating and moments of not eating. The reason the body does not simply use fat first all the time is that different fuels serve different purposes. Glucose is especially useful because it is quick, easy to circulate, and important for tissues that depend heavily on it. Fat is dense, efficient, and excellent for longer-term use, but it cannot directly solve every immediate need in the same way. So the early part of fasting is still more dependent on carbohydrate support. The later part increasingly invites fat into the center of the stage. The body is not discovering fat for the first time, of course. It uses fat all the time to varying degrees. What changes during fasting is the scale and priority of that use. The hormonal environment is central to this change. As the fed state fades, insulin falls. That falling insulin matters enormously, because insulin is one of the hormones that encourages storage and tends to suppress the release of fuel from fat tissue. When insulin levels are higher, the body is more oriented toward using incoming nutrients and storing excess. When insulin falls, one of the brakes on fat release begins to loosen. At the same time, other hormones begin encouraging the mobilization of stored energy. Hormone-sensitive lipase in fat tissue becomes more active. Triglycerides stored in fat cells begin to break down into free fatty acids and glycerol. Those fatty acids can then be released into the bloodstream and used by many tissues for energy. This is one of the most important things to grasp. Fat loss and fat use are not mystical states. They are biochemical events. Stored fat is held mostly as triglycerides. When the body needs more energy from stored reserves, those triglycerides are broken apart. Fatty acids are released and carried through the blood. Tissues that can use them, such as muscles and many other organs, begin drawing on them more heavily. The glycerol portion can also be used by the liver in ways that help support glucose production. So the turning point is not a vague idea about switching into fat burning. It is an actual shift in what molecules are being released, transported, and oxidized for energy. This is also where people sometimes begin to notice a different feel to fasting, not always, and not identically, but often enough to be worth mentioning. The early hours can feel like a matter of waiting. Hunger may be fairly loud. The body is still leaning on its short-term carbohydrate strategy. Then, as the shift progresses, some people feel a little steadier. Appetite may change. Energy may begin to feel less tied to immediate food intake. There can be a sense in some people that the body has settled into a different mode. This does not happen at exactly the same hour for everyone. It depends on glycogen status, previous meals, activity, insulin sensitivity, body composition, sleep, stress, and all the usual complications of being a human organism rather than a textbook diagram. But broadly speaking, once the metabolism begins relying more meaningfully on stored fat, the experience of fasting often changes with it. That does not mean it always becomes easier in some magical, universally liberating way. For some people, this turning point feels smooth and clear. For others, it feels awkward, sluggish, or mildly annoying. A person accustomed to frequent meals and constant carbohydrate intake may feel that transition more sharply at first. A person who regularly goes longer between meals may move through it with less fuss. Adaptation matters. The body can become more flexible with repeated exposure to fasting or with diets and routines that improve metabolic switching. But not everyone begins from the same place, and the body's flexibility is always influenced by broader health. Metabolic flexibility is the phrase often used here, and it is a useful one. It refers to the body's ability to shift between fuel sources according to availability and demand. A metabolically flexible body can use carbohydrate effectively when food is present and increase fat use when food is absent. It does not get stuck insisting on one fuel under all conditions. Like a very stubborn chef who only knows how to cook with one pan, it adapts. In many ways, fasting is a test of that flexibility. The better the body can make the transition from glycogen dependence toward greater fat use, the steadier the process may feel. The liver remains deeply involved during this turning point, though its role begins to evolve. Earlier, it was heavily engaged in breaking down glycogen to maintain blood glucose. As glycogen stores decline, the liver increasingly turns to other strategies. One of them is gluconeogenesis, the production of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as glycerol, lactate, and certain amino acids. Another is the production of ketone bodies from fatty acids. This is where the turning point begins to deepen into something more metabolically distinctive. The body is not merely using fat more, it is beginning to transform part of that fat-derived fuel into substances that can help support organs like the brain, when glucose alone is no longer the whole story. But before ketones become the headline, there is this intermediate stage where the body is widening its fuel supply without fully abandoning its glucose responsibilities. Blood sugar still matters. The brain still needs support. Some tissues continue relying heavily on glucose, so the turning point is not about replacing sugar with fat in a simple one-for-one exchange. It is about reducing the body's dependence on immediate carbohydrate reserves and increasing its use of fat while also preparing other supportive pathways. The metabolism becomes more diversified. It stops leaning so hard on the short-term plan and begins bringing the long-term plan online. There is something very practical about this. The body is not idealistic. It does not care what diet trend is currently being argued over by strangers with microphones. It uses what is available, then what is stored, then what can be made. It changes priority according to circumstance. If food is coming in, use it. If it stops, release glycogen. If glycogen falls, mobilize fat. If the brain needs another fuel option, begin increasing ketones. This is not a belief system, it is logistics. One of the reasons the turning point matters so much for fasting is that it marks the moment when the body is no longer simply coasting on the leftovers of a recent meal. It is actively reorganizing its economy. During the early phase, you're still living partly on stored carbohydrate that was designed for short gaps. After the turning point, the body is more clearly behaving as though the pause in food may continue. It starts acting less like a household finishing leftovers and more like a household opening the pantry, freezer, and long-term reserves with calm efficiency. The plan is no longer just use what is on the counter. The plan is we are now managing a longer interval. This also helps explain why longer fasting windows can produce effects that shorter gaps between meals do not. A routine overnight fast may rely heavily on glycogen and only lightly touch the deeper parts of this transition, depending on timing and individual variation. Extend the fast, and the body moves further into the fat-mobilizing phase. Hormonal patterns change more noticeably. Ketone production begins to matter more. Appetite may shift. Energy use across tissues changes. This is why duration matters so much when people make claims about fasting. 10 hours is not the same as 18. 18 is not the same as 30. The turning point is not symbolic. It is metabolic, and metabolism works in time. Still, it would be misleading to suggest that this stage means the body is now happily running on fat alone and all is settled forever. Even once the shift begins, fuel use remains mixed. Glucose is still being regulated. The liver is still involved in supporting blood sugar. Protein must still be preserved as much as possible. The body is always balancing multiple needs at once. It is trying to keep the brain supplied, maintain function, protect critical tissues, and conserve where it can. Fat becomes increasingly important, yes, but this is a managed transition, not a triumphant slogan. The appetite side of the experience can be interesting here too. Many people expect hunger to grow in a straight line the longer they go without food, as though appetite were a thermostat with a broken dial. But hunger often behaves more like weather. It arrives in waves, influenced by routine and hormone pulses, and can sometimes soften during the very stage when the body begins using stored fat more effectively. That does not mean fasting becomes pleasant for everyone, nor does it mean hunger disappears, but it does help explain why some people are surprised to find that the hardest part of a fast may come earlier rather than later. The body can be noisier when it is between strategies than when it has more fully shifted into the new one. Sleep, stress, and prior nutrition all shape this turning point too. A person who slept poorly may find the transition rougher because sleep loss affects insulin sensitivity, hunger hormones, cortisol, and appetite regulation. A person under heavy stress may feel fasting more sharply because the body is already handling other demands. Someone who ate very little the previous day may reach the turning point sooner or feel more strained. Someone who ate well, slept well, and is accustomed to longer gaps between meals may barely notice the change, except for a slight sense of emptiness and an elevated interest in lunch menus. Context always matters. The body does not enter this stage as a blank slate. It arrives carrying yesterday with it. Exercise can accelerate or complicate the turning point depending on intensity. Light movement can sometimes feel quite good during this stage because muscles begin drawing more on fatty acids and the body's already mobilizing stored fuel. Hard training, on the other hand, especially high-intensity work, may still strongly depend on glycogen. If glycogen is low and demand is high, performance can suffer. This is one reason not all forms of exercise pair equally well with fasting. A quiet walk and repeated all-out intervals are not metabolically interchangeable, no matter what enthusiastic internet advice may suggest. The body's changing energy source has consequences for what it can do comfortably. There is also a deeper biological wisdom in the timing of this shift. Glycogen is used first because it is accessible and protective. Fat becomes more central later because it is abundant and efficient. The body does not rush to the long-term reserve while short-term reserves are still available. That would be wasteful and unnecessary. Instead, it moves in stages. It begins with what is easiest, then it expands. The turning point exists because the body is economical. It does not abandon one system before it needs to. It adds layers only when the situation calls for them. This stage also highlights the difference between being energy poor in the moment and being fuel rich overall. A person may not have food entering the system, but that does not mean the system lacks energy. If body fat is present, then stored energy is present. The challenge is not whether energy exists. The challenge is whether the body can access and use it effectively while still preserving critical functions. That is exactly what the hormonal changes of fasting are designed to improve. Falling insulin, rising fat mobilization, increasing metabolic flexibility, and eventual ketone production all help solve the problem of access. Energy is there. The body is learning to use more of it. This point may sound obvious, but it is surprisingly important in modern discussions about hunger and meal timing. Many people are taught to treat every strong appetite signal as proof that the body urgently needs incoming calories. Sometimes it does, of course. Context matters. But sometimes appetite simply means the body is in transition. The brain is expecting food, and the hormonal system is still learning how to rely more smoothly on stored fuel. In a healthy and appropriate context, a period of hunger does not necessarily mean the body is in immediate danger. It may mean the body is changing gears. That is uncomfortable, perhaps, but not the same thing as broken. And that, in many ways, is what this turning point really is. A gear change. The body moves from the short-term sugar strategy toward a broader fuel economy built more around stored fat. Glycogen is still part of the story, but less dominant. Glucose is still being protected, but no longer supported in quite the same way. Hormones change the rules. Fatty acids begin circulating more. The liver begins making different calculations. The metabolism starts preparing not just for another hour without food, but for a longer stretch of internal self-sufficiency. It is a remarkably competent shift when you think about it. No speeches, no banners, no dramatic announcement from the pancreas. Just cells responding to signals, enzymes changing activity, tissues choosing different fuels, the liver altering its output, the body reorganizing the flow of energy with the matter-of-fact calm of a system that has done this for millennia. From the outside, it may just feel like a quiet stomach, a slight edge of focus, or an annoying awareness that lunch is still some distance away. Inside, however, the fuel economy is changing, and once that change gathers more momentum, another question comes into view. If the body is now reaching more meaningfully into stored fat, what does that process actually look like, and how does fat become usable fuel rather than simply something tucked away in tissue waiting for a future emergency? By the time the body reaches the stage where stored fat begins to matter more seriously, something important has already happened. It has stopped depending so heavily on the immediate comfort of incoming food and the short-term backup of glycogen alone. It has begun widening the search. The easy-access sugar reserve is no longer enough to carry the whole task, and the body turns toward a source of energy that is larger, slower, and in many ways more impressive. It begins drawing on stored fat. This is the point where fasting starts to look less like merely delaying a meal, and more like a genuine change in fuel strategy. The body is no longer just finishing what was recently available. It is opening the long-term reserve and learning to run on its own stored energy. There is something quietly remarkable about that. Most of us carry around a substantial amount of stored energy in fat tissue, even people who would not think of themselves as having very much. Fat is the body's main long-term savings account. It is dense, efficient, and designed for storage. Gram for gram, fat contains far more energy than carbohydrate. That is one reason the body stores excess energy this way rather than trying to pack everything into glycogen. Glycogen is useful, but bulky, limited, and bound up with water. Fat is more compact. It is the form of storage you would choose if you were building a body meant to survive intervals between meals, unpredictable food availability, and the basic fact that life does not always deliver lunch on schedule. Still, stored fat is not immediately usable in the same way that glucose in the blood is. The body cannot simply point at an adipose cell and say, "Splendid, there is dinner, let us proceed." Stored fat must be mobilized, broken down, transported, taken up by tissues, and then processed in ways that turn it into usable energy. This is what people are usually referring to, often somewhat loosely, when they say the body burns fat. The phrase is common, but it can be misleading. Fat burning is not a bonfire. It is not a dramatic internal incineration where adipose tissue bursts into flames, while your metabolism cheers from the sidelines. It is a carefully regulated series of biochemical steps. The body releases stored fat in response to hormonal signals, carries it through the blood, and uses it inside cells to produce energy. The first step in that process begins in fat tissue itself. Most stored fat in the body is held in adipocytes, the cells that make up adipose tissue in the form of triglycerides. A triglyceride is made of 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. When the body wants to access this stored energy, those triglycerides are broken apart. This process is called lipolysis. Hormones help regulate it, and one of the biggest changes that makes lipolysis easier during fasting is the falling level of insulin. Insulin, among many other things, tends to restrain fat release when food is abundant. When insulin is elevated, the body is more inclined to store energy. When insulin falls during fasting, some of that restraint is lifted. Other signals, including catecholamines like adrenaline and noradrenaline, help encourage the release of fatty acids from fat cells. The door to the storage room opens more easily. Once triglycerides are broken down, the fatty acids and glycerol do not all go to the same place for the same purpose. The fatty acids are released into the bloodstream, where they travel bound to albumin, a protein that helps transport them. From there, tissues that can use fatty acids begin taking them up for energy. Muscles are a major example. The heart also uses fatty acids very readily. Many tissues are quite capable of shifting toward greater fat use when fasting continues. The glycerol portion, meanwhile, travels to the liver, where it can contribute to gluconeogenesis, the production of new glucose. That matters because even while the body is increasingly relying on fat, it still has responsibilities to blood glucose. Some tissues continue needing glucose, and the brain still depends on it significantly, especially before ketones rise more fully. So the breakdown of stored fat supports fasting in more than one way. The fatty acids provide direct fuel. The glycerol helps support ongoing glucose production. This is where the body's economy begins to look especially clever. Nothing is wasted. Stored fat is not just dead weight waiting to be judged by bathroom scales and regretted at beach holidays. It is active reserve. It is planning made physical. When fasting reaches this stage, the body begins cashing in that reserve in a controlled and useful way. It does not empty the account recklessly. It does not throw energy around in a panic. It releases what is needed, where it is needed, according to demand and available signals. The metabolism is not chaotic, it is adaptive. For many tissues, this increase in fatty acid use is a natural and effective shift. Cells take up fatty acids and process them in the mitochondria through beta oxidation, a pathway that breaks fatty acids down into smaller units that can be used to generate ATP, the cell's immediate energy currency. ATP is what powers all the ordinary work of life: muscle contraction, ion transport, cell signaling, biosynthesis, repair, and countless other functions that continue whether or not you have eaten breakfast. Fatty acids therefore become a major source of support for the fasting body. They help spare glucose for tissues that need it more urgently and reduce the body's dependence on dwindling glycogen reserves. This sparing effect matters. One of the great tasks of fasting metabolism is not simply finding energy somewhere, but allocating fuels wisely. The body does not want to burn through glucose irresponsibly if it can use fat for many of the tissues that are perfectly capable of doing so. It does not want to degrade large amounts of protein unnecessarily just to maintain blood sugar if fat is available. So as the body learns to use stored energy more effectively, it is also preserving what is more limited or more urgently needed elsewhere. This is one reason fat metabolism becomes such an important feature of longer fasting windows. It extends the body's ability to function without incoming food, while reducing strain on the short-term carbohydrate system. There is a phrase sometimes used here that is worth keeping in mind: fuel partitioning. It sounds slightly like something discussed in a very stern engineering meeting, but it simply refers to how the body divides up different energy sources for different tissues and different needs. During the fed state, incoming food makes certain patterns more dominant. During fasting, those patterns change. More tissues begin using fatty acids. The liver increases glucose production only as needed. Eventually, ketone bodies rise and help take some of the burden off glucose for the brain. The body is constantly partitioning fuel according to availability, urgency, and tissue preference. It is a kind of metabolic traffic management, and stored fat becomes one of the major roads opening up when food disappears from the scene. One of the interesting things about this stage is that it often reveals how flexible or inflexible a person's metabolism may feel in daily life. Someone who is metabolically flexible may transition into greater fat use without much fuss. Hunger may settle. Energy may remain reasonably stable. They may not feel especially dramatic about the whole affair, except perhaps for a mild sense of emptiness and a growing appreciation for the existence of lunch. Someone who is less adapted to this shift may feel rougher at first. The body can still do it, but the transition may be bumpier. They may feel mentally preoccupied with food, experience more fatigue, or notice a sharper drop in comfort before the system settles into better reliance on stored energy. This difference is one reason fasting can feel so unequal in practice. Two people can go the same number of hours without food and report utterly different experiences. One describes calm focus. The other describes a slow descent into grumpiness, accompanied by unusually emotional thoughts about bread. Neither person is necessarily wrong. The body's capacity to move into fat use smoothly depends on many things: prior eating patterns, insulin sensitivity, body composition, sleep quality, stress hormones, physical activity, and individual biology. Adaptation matters too. Like many systems in the body, this one gets better with practice, within reason, and within healthy context. A body that is used to always having food, arrive every few hours may take time to rediscover how to trust its own reserves. There is also something psychologically interesting about this phase, because it challenges the modern habit of equating appetite with immediate biological need. In a healthy person, the presence of stored fat means there is energy available even when the stomach is empty. The issue is not absence of fuel in the absolute sense. The issue is whether the body is ready and able to access that fuel efficiently. This is why the phrase, burning stored energy, is so useful. It reminds us that fasting is not about running on nothing. It is about switching supply chains. The meal is gone, yes, but the reserve is still there. The body is learning to open it. That learning is biochemical, but it can also feel experiential. Some people notice that once they are a bit further into a fast, their energy feels less up and down than it did earlier. That may reflect a more stable reliance on fatty acids and a reduced sense of chasing incoming glucose. Others notice that light movement feels surprisingly good. A walk, some gentle work, an ordinary morning routine can feel supported rather than depleted. This is not because the body has transcended human limitation and become a higher metabolic being. It is because fatty acids are now contributing more meaningfully to the energy supply of working tissues. The body is tapping the reserve in a way it was designed to do. At the same time, there are limits and caveats. Not every activity is equally easy on fat-derived fuel. High-intensity exercise still tends to rely more heavily on glycogen and carbohydrate metabolism because rapid energy demand often exceeds what fat oxidation alone can provide quickly. This is why a quiet fasted walk and an all-out sprint are very different metabolic events. The body can draw on stored fat beautifully for many tasks, especially lower intensity and longer duration ones, but it does not become indifferent to all forms of effort just because fatty acids are circulating. The type of demand still matters. The body remains a strategist, not a magician. The heart is a particularly good example of how useful fatty acids can be. The heart is metabolically busy at all times. It cannot take a tea break. It continues beating, circulating blood, responding to changing demands, and maintaining life while you sleep, think, worry, and occasionally stand in the kitchen wondering whether sparkling water counts as excitement. The heart uses fatty acids very efficiently, and during fasting it remains one of the tissues that can run well on this form of fuel. Muscles too, especially at rest or during mild activity, increase their use of fatty acids. In a sense, fasting invites many tissues to stop relying so heavily on sugar and let the body's stored reserve do more of the heavy lifting. There is a practical wisdom in that shift. Sugar, in the form of glucose and glycogen, is precious and limited. Fat is abundant and energy-dense. So if the body can move more of the general workload onto fatty acids, it can preserve glucose for tissues and functions that need it most. This reduces the pressure on gluconeogenesis and helps spare protein. Protein sparing is especially important because while the body can use amino acids to make glucose, it does not want to strip down lean tissue unnecessarily. Stored fat is therefore not just useful for supplying energy. It is also protective. It helps prevent the body from turning too quickly to less desirable sources. This brings us to one of the great misunderstandings in casual talk about fasting and body composition. People often imagine fat tissue as passive, almost inert, like luggage stored in a basement until someone notices it. But adipose tissue is biologically active. It responds to hormones, it releases fatty acids, it communicates with the rest of the body through signaling molecules. It participates in energy regulation. During fasting, adipose tissue becomes a central player in the story. It is not merely present, it is being consulted, it is contributing. It is part of the body's plan for continuity. The liver, meanwhile, is not only receiving glycerol for gluconeogenesis, it is also taking up some of the circulating fatty acids and processing them further. When the supply of fatty acids rises and carbohydrate availability falls, the liver begins converting some of those fatty acids into ketone bodies. These ketones, which will become more important in the next stage, are a kind of alternative fuel, especially valuable for the brain during longer fasting. In that sense, the body's increased use of stored fat is not the end of the shift, but the beginning of another one. Fat into fuel is not just about muscles and tissues burning more fatty acids directly. It is also about setting up the conditions for ketone production to increase. Stored fat is feeding multiple pathways now. It is supporting the present and preparing the next adaptation. One thing worth saying gently is that this process does not look the same in every body, and the presence of body fat does not mean fasting is always appropriate or always easy. Hormonal disorders, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, medication use, metabolic disease, eating disorders, pregnancy, illness, and high training loads can all change how the body experiences fasting and how readily it accesses stored energy. The underlying biochemistry may still operate, but the comfort, safety, and suitability of fasting vary with context. Biology is not impressed by neat rules applied carelessly. It always asks whose body, under what conditions, with what needs. Even in healthy conditions, the body's use of stored fat is not instantaneous perfection. There can be a period of adaptation. Hunger may still arise in waves. Mood may wobble. Mental clarity may not yet feel especially glorious. Some people experience a sense of steadiness only after repeated exposure to fasting or after changing diet patterns in ways that make metabolic switching easier. Others never particularly enjoy the feeling and simply prefer not to arrange their eating this way. All of that is fine. The goal here is not to romanticize fasting. It is to understand what the body is doing when food is absent. And one of the main things it is doing at this stage is learning to draw more heavily from the enormous reservoir it already carries. There is something almost old-fashioned about that ability, in the best sense. The body does not assume abundance. It prepares for intervals. It does not panic when the plate is removed. It checks its stores. It reduces dependence on the short-term reserve and begins relying on longer-term fuel. It sends out hormonal signals, opens up fat cells, releases fatty acids, distributes them to tissues, and quietly keeps the operation going. This is metabolic thrift in its most useful form. Not meanness, not deprivation, but efficiency. If you were to reduce all this to the most basic image, you might say that during the early stages of fasting, the body lives on the kitchen counter and the fridge. It uses what was just brought home, then the leftovers, then the short-term cupboard stock. At this stage, it begins going into the pantry and the freezer. It is drawing from deeper reserves. That does not mean the house is in trouble. It means the household is functioning exactly as intended. Meals are not the only source of energy. The stored reserve exists so the body can bridge time without fear, and yet, even as fatty acids become more central, one organ remains slightly awkward in all of this: the brain. The brain can use some fuel strategies and not others. It cannot simply run entirely on fatty acids in the same direct way many other tissues can. So, while stored fat has become the major reserve that keeps much of the body going, the metabolism still needs another answer for the organ that insists on staying active, thoughtful, emotionally dramatic, and occasionally unable to stop replaying conversations from years ago. That answer begins to emerge from the liver in the form of ketones, and once they begin to rise, the experience of fasting starts to change again. By the time fasting has continued long enough for stored fat to become a more serious part of the body's fuel economy, an interesting problem begins to take shape. Many tissues can happily use fatty acids directly. Muscles can do it. The heart can do it. Various organs can shift their energy habits quite effectively when food is not coming in. But the brain is more complicated. The brain is an expensive organ, metabolically speaking. It uses a large share of the body's energy, and it is not especially fond of sudden interruptions to its supply. It wants fuel, it wants it reliably, and it would very much prefer not to be dragged into your nutritional experiments unless there is a proper backup plan in place. That backup plan, at least in longer stretches without food, begins to arrive in the form of ketones. Ketones are often spoken about with a sort of glowing intensity that makes them sound either like miraculous brain nectar or the private obsession of people who own far too many measuring devices. In reality, ketones are neither magic nor nonsense. They are a practical metabolic solution. When carbohydrate availability falls and fat mobilization rises, the liver begins converting some of those fat-derived materials into small molecules called ketone bodies. The main ones are acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate, along with a small amount of acetone, which is less useful as fuel and more useful for making the breath of prolonged fasting or ketosis smell oddly chemical, which is perhaps not the most glamorous feature of the whole arrangement. But the important point is simple. Ketones are alternative fuel. They give the brain another option. That option matters because while the brain can run partly on glucose and later partly on ketones, it cannot simply use fatty acids directly in the same large-scale way many other tissues can. Fatty acids do not cross into the brain with the same ease, and the brain's energy needs remain high whether or not you have eaten recently. So as fasting continues and the body shifts away from relying mainly on glycogen, the liver begins increasing ketone production to help support the brain. This is one of the most important turning points in prolonged fasting because it changes the conversation between body and mind. The brain is no longer relying quite so exclusively on glucose. A new fuel begins joining the supply line. That does not happen instantly. The rise in ketones is gradual. In the early hours of fasting, ketone levels are low and the brain still relies mostly on glucose. As fasting extends and insulin remains low, while fat mobilization continues, ketone production increases. The liver takes fatty acids, processes them, and produces ketone bodies that circulate through the blood and can cross into the brain. There, neurons and other brain cells can use them as an energy source. This is not a complete replacement for glucose, especially at first. The brain still needs some glucose. But ketones reduce how much glucose it needs, and therefore reduce the pressure on the body to keep making glucose from limited sources. That pressure reduction is more important than it may sound. If the brain remained completely dependent on glucose during prolonged fasting, the body would have to rely much more heavily on gluconeogenesis, including from amino acids derived from protein. In plain language, it would have to break down more of its own tissue to keep the brain fed. Ketones help prevent that. They are part of the body's protein-sparing strategy. By offering the brain another usable fuel, ketones allow the body to preserve lean tissue more effectively during fasting. Once again, the metabolism shows itself to be less dramatic and more sensible than popular talk often suggests. It is not improvising wildly. It is protecting priorities. This change in fuel also influences how fasting feels mentally. Some people report that once ketones rise more meaningfully, their mind feels clearer. Thoughts may seem steadier. Energy may feel less tied to the timing of meals. There can be a certain calmness, an absence of the sharp up and down feelings some people associate with heavy reliance on frequent carbohydrate intake. That experience is real for many people, but it should be described carefully. It is not universal, it is not guaranteed, and it is not proof that ketones have turned the brain into a superior philosophical instrument capable of solving both consciousness and your email backlog before lunch. What it usually reflects is a combination of fuel stability, hormonal context, appetite changes, and individual metabolic response. The brain is extremely sensitive to fluctuations in energy supply, but it is also remarkably adaptable. When ketones become more available, the brain begins increasing its use of them over time. This adaptation is not merely passive. The transport of ketones into the brain and their utilization can become more effective with continued exposure. In other words, the brain learns. It does not approach ketones like a suspicious tourist poking unfamiliar food with a fork. It becomes better at using them as fasting continues, or when a person regularly spends time in metabolic states where ketones rise. This is one reason some people feel a distinct adjustment period when first experimenting with longer fasts or ketogenic diets. The machinery is there, but the body may not be especially practiced at using it smoothly. There is an important difference here between the biochemistry and the feeling. Biochemically, the body begins producing and using ketones according to hormonal and energetic conditions. Experientially, a person may feel anything from quite good to rather miserable, depending on how that transition is going. Some people experience the early phase of ketone increase as a period of mental fog, fatigue, or irritability before the brain settles into using them more comfortably. Others barely notice the transition at all. Some feel distinctly sharper. The range of human experience remains impressive, occasionally inconvenient, and never fully obedient to neat theories. Part of the reason ketones can support mental steadiness is that their availability does not depend on meal timing in the same way immediate glucose supply does. When the body is effectively mobilizing fat and producing ketones, the brain is drawing on a fuel that comes from internal reserves rather than from whatever happened to be eaten 2 hours ago. That can create a sense of continuity. The mind no longer feels so tied to the arrival of the next meal, at least for some people. The sharpest edge of hunger may soften. Concentration may feel more sustainable. There can be a sensation of running on a quieter current. This is one reason fasting has often been described, across different cultures and eras, as a state associated not only with hunger, but with altered mental experience. Sometimes that has been interpreted spiritually, sometimes medically, sometimes philosophically. Biology does not need to dismiss those interpretations to explain part of what may be happening underneath them. A brain that is being supplied differently may feel different. A body operating without the constant digestion of meals may feel different. Hormones change, attention changes. The rhythms of appetite shift. Ketones join the energy supply. All of that can influence consciousness in subtle ways. Still, subtle is the right word most of the time. For ordinary fasting and healthy people, the brain does not become an entirely different organ. It remains the same slightly demanding, pattern-making, memory-collecting, anxiety-capable structure it was yesterday. It still gets distracted. It still invents concerns. It still decides at inconvenient moments to replay things you said years ago with the confidence of a courtroom stenographer. Ketones do not make the mind perfect, they simply provide fuel in a different metabolic context. Sometimes that context feels noticeably good, sometimes it just feels functional, sometimes it feels like you should probably eat lunch soon. It is worth being careful here because modern conversations about ketones can become oddly inflated. On one side, they are praised as though they are a hidden key to all mental performance, mood regulation, and perhaps tidy kitchen habits. On the other, they are dismissed as overhyped chemistry for people who enjoy turning breakfast into ideology. The truth, as usual, is more grounded. Ketones are useful. They are evolutionarily sensible. They help the brain function during extended periods without food. They can influence mental experience. They may have effects beyond simple fuel provision, including signaling roles in the body that researchers continue to study. But they are not a mystical state. They are molecules doing a job. One of the more interesting aspects of ketones is that they may affect the brain not only as fuel, but also as signaling compounds. Beta-hydroxybutyrate in particular appears to have roles that go beyond merely being burned for energy. Research suggests it may influence gene expression, oxidative stress responses, and inflammatory pathways in certain contexts. It may even affect the production of certain brain-derived factors involved in neural health. This area is complex and still being worked out, and it is easy to overstate what is known. But it does suggest that the brain's relationship with ketones is not purely one of emergency feeding. Ketones may also carry information. They may signal that the body is in a different metabolic state and prompt adjustments that go beyond calories alone. That possibility has helped drive scientific interest in ketogenic diets and fasting for certain neurological conditions. Epilepsy is the best known example. Ketogenic diets have been used for quite some time to help manage some forms of epilepsy, especially in children whose seizures do not respond well to medication. Exactly why ketosis helps in those cases is still not fully understood, which is both fascinating and deeply typical of biology. The brain is not an easy organ to interrogate politely, but the clinical usefulness of ketosis in some contexts suggests that ketones are not just tolerated by the brain. Under certain conditions, they may change brain function in meaningful ways. That does not mean everyone should immediately start interpreting every pleasant fasted morning as proof of neurological genius. Clinical uses of ketosis occur in specific contexts, under careful supervision, and do not automatically translate into ordinary wellness claims. Still, they remind us that the brain's fuel environment matters. It matters for cognition, mood, stability, and overall function. During fasting, that environment changes. Glucose does not disappear, but ketones join the picture and alter the balance. The emotional side of fasting is tied into this too. Hunger, mood, and mental clarity are not separate worlds. They're deeply linked through hormones, brain circuits, past habits, and fuel availability. Early in fasting, before ketones rise significantly, some people feel edgy or preoccupied with food. Later, when the body's more successfully mobilizing fat and producing ketones, that edge may soften. It is as though the brain becomes less anxious about supply, not because it has become enlightened, but because it is being reassured chemically. Fuel is arriving. The source has changed, but the lights are still on. The system is stable enough to stop sending quite so many urgent memos about crackers. At the same time, not everyone experiences fasting as mentally calming. Some people feel more stressed, not less. They may find that fasting makes them anxious, distracted, or low in energy. There are good reasons for this. Fasting is still a form of physiological stress. It changes hormone levels. It can raise cortisol in some contexts. It can feel threatening to a body already under strain from poor sleep, heavy exercise, emotional stress, undernourishment, or blood sugar dysregulation. In those cases, the brain may not interpret the metabolic shift as calm competence. It may interpret it as another demand piled onto an already busy desk. Context, again, decides so much. Sleep loss is particularly relevant. A sleep-deprived brain is not the same brain metabolically or emotionally. it handles glucose differently. Hunger hormones change, cortisol shifts, emotional regulation worsens, decision-making becomes less elegant. In that state, fasting may feel much harsher than it would after solid rest. The same fasting window that produces calm clarity on one day can produce irritable nonsense on another, simply because the body arrived under different conditions. This is one reason universal claims about fasting and mental performance are so unreliable. The brain always brings the rest of the body with it. Hydration matters too, and often more than people realize. As fasting continues, especially if glycogen is being used and water is being lost along with it, some people can become a bit underhydrated or low in electrolytes, particularly sodium. That can contribute to headaches, fatigue, fogginess, and the sense that fasting is making the brain feel terrible. Sometimes the issue is not ketones themselves, or the lack of food so much as the broader fluid and mineral context in which fasting is taking place. The body is one system. When one part of the experience feels unpleasant, the cause is not always where popular narratives place it. One of the more subtle mental changes people describe in longer fasting is a narrowing of distraction. Thoughts may feel quieter, attention may feel less scattered. Again, this is not universal, but it is common enough to be interesting. Some of that may reflect the absence of frequent digestive activity, and the reduced cycle of eating, rising glucose, digesting, and thinking about the next meal. Some may reflect ketones and the steadier fuel supply they represent. Some may reflect the simple fact that not eating removes one category of daily decision-making, which can make the mind feel oddly uncluttered. If breakfast is not under discussion, the day may seem to begin with fewer negotiations. There's also something older and more animal about it. In evolutionary terms, a body that became uselessly sleepy or cognitively chaotic every time food was unavailable would not have done especially well. Some degree of maintained or even sharpened alertness during food scarcity would be advantageous. The organism still needs to function. It still needs to move, notice, decide, search, and respond. Ketones may be part of that adaptive picture. They help the brain keep going when the usual glucose-heavy arrangement is no longer enough. They support continuity at a moment when continuity matters. This does not mean prolonged fasting is always mentally beneficial. Past a certain point, or in the wrong context, fasting can impair cognition, mood, and judgment. Energy conservation can become more pronounced. Irritability can rise. Obsession with food can dominate. The mind can become narrowed in less charming ways. The useful ketone-supported phase of fasting exists on a continuum, not in a fantasy world where longer is always better. Biology tends to reward moderation and context far more than ideology. Another interesting feature of ketones is that their presence can change appetite itself. This is not entirely a brain story, but the brain certainly notices it. Many people report that hunger is most intense before ketones rise significantly, then becomes more manageable once they are clearly present. The relationship is not perfectly understood and likely involves several hormones and signaling systems. But the effect is familiar enough that it has become one of the defining subjective features of longer fasting for many people. It is as though the brain moves from immediate concern to conditional acceptance. Very well, it seems to say. We are not eating, but fuel is still arriving, so I shall postpone my more dramatic speeches for now. That shift can feel surprisingly freeing to some people, especially those who are used to strong meal-to-meal appetite swings. The brain becomes less reactive to food timing, less fixed on the next chance to eat, more willing to let time pass without sounding alarms. But again, this is not everyone. Some people never experience fasting this way, and instead remain intensely aware of food throughout. Bodies differ, histories differ, hormonal patterns differ. The mind is never just a fuel meter. It is also memory, habit, reward, fear, culture, and personality all braided together. Even so, ketones remain one of the clearest examples of the body's ability to support the mind under changing conditions. They show that fasting is not merely the subtraction of food. It is the activation of an alternative system. The brain is not simply deprived, it is resupplied. The route changes, the chemistry changes, the experience may change with it, but the central fact remains. The body is still trying to protect the brain, still trying to keep thought, perception and awareness functioning while meals are absent. Ketones are part of how it does that. There is also a certain humility in recognizing that many of the mental effects people attribute to fasting may not be solely about fasting at all. They may be about relief from overeating, about more stable blood sugar, about the absence of digestive discomfort, about improved attention, about sleep, about the placebo effect, about ritual, about expectation, or about the simple psychological pleasure some people get from structure. The brain lives in layers. Ketones are one layer, a real one, but never the whole story. What happens to the mind during fasting is always more than molecules alone, even though molecules are doing essential work behind the scenes. Still, those molecules matter. They matter enough that the body evolved the capacity to make them in exactly this context. They matter enough that the brain gradually adapts to use them. They matter enough that people can feel the difference between a brain running mainly on one fuel pattern and a brain supplied by a more mixed fasting state economy. Whether that difference feels subtle or striking, ketones are part of the reason the mind does not simply fail when food disappears for a while. They are the body's quiet assurance that fasting does not have to mean immediate cognitive collapse. The conversation between liver and brain remains open. Fuel changes form, but it still arrives. And while the brain is learning to accept this new arrangement, another side of fasting continues making itself known in a much more direct, much less philosophical way. Because even if ketones help steady the mind, the body still has a voice of its own, and one of the loudest voices in the entire experience is hunger. It rises, falls, argues, persuades, and often behaves less like a simple empty tank and more like a patterned signal with its own rhythm and timing. Hunger is one of those experiences that seems simple until you look at it closely, and then it becomes wonderfully inconvenient. On the surface, it feels obvious. You have not eaten, so you feel hungry. End of story. The stomach is empty, the body wants food, and now your thoughts begin drifting toward toast, with the seriousness usually reserved for legal documents or weather warnings. But biologically, hunger is not just emptiness. It is not a single alarm triggered by a single cause. It is a conversation. It involves the stomach, the brain, hormones, blood sugar, memory, habit, smell, sight, stress, sleep, routine, and expectation. This is why hunger can feel loud when the body still has plenty of stored energy available, and why it can disappear for a while even when you have not eaten for hours. Hunger is real, but it is not simple, and during fasting, one of the strangest and most revealing things about it is that it often comes in waves. That wave-like quality surprises people, especially when they first begin paying attention to fasting. Many expect hunger to rise steadily the longer they go without food, as though it were water filling a bathtub. No breakfast means more hunger by 10 o'clock, more still by 11, then steadily upward until by noon you are gnawing thoughtfully on the furniture and considering whether the decorative rosemary plant on the windowsill counts as a salad. But that is not usually what happens. More often, hunger arrives, becomes noticeable, even persuasive, and then fades again. It can return later, then soften once more. It behaves less like a straight line and more like weather moving through. A front rolls in, it passes. Another one may follow. The body is not just telling you energy low, please refill. It is producing a pattern of signals shaped by far more than fuel alone. One of the central players in that pattern is ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone. Ghrelin is made mainly in the stomach, though other tissues contribute as well, and it tends to rise before meals and fall after eating. That sounds straightforward enough, but the interesting part is that ghrelin is not merely tracking absolute emptiness. It is also rhythmic. It responds to learned meal times. If you regularly eat lunch at noon, ghrelin may rise as noon approaches whether or not your body is in urgent need of food. It has learned the routine. The body is predictive. It prepares for expected events. So hunger often reflects timing as much as depletion. You're not just hungry because you have not eaten. You're hungry because your body has become accustomed to eating now. That predictive quality explains a great deal about why hunger feels the way it does during fasting. Suppose you usually eat breakfast at 8, have coffee at 10, lunch at 1, and something sweet at 4 because the afternoon has become unreasonable, and a biscuit seems like a practical response. Your body learns this schedule. Hormones rise around those times. Appetite becomes linked to the clock. Digestive readiness changes. Then one day you skip breakfast. The hunger that appears at 8:30 may feel like hard proof that the body desperately needs immediate calories. In some cases, it may indeed be asking for food. But in many cases, it is also responding to routine. It expected a meal. The meal has not arrived, so it sends the usual signal anyway. Hunger comes to the door because hunger has been invited at this hour for weeks, months, or years. This does not make hunger imaginary. Predictive does not mean fake. If your body is used to food at a certain time, the hormonal and neurological signals associated with that meal are real. You feel them. The stomach may tighten. Salivation may increase. Thoughts of food may become more vivid. Mood may sharpen in a slightly uncharitable direction. But understanding that these signals are shaped by habit can be surprisingly helpful. It means the first wave of hunger is not always a precise reflection of fuel shortage. Sometimes it is more like a familiar appointment the body assumed would be kept. The stomach plays its part in this too, though not quite in the simple way people imagine. Hunger is not caused merely by an empty stomach sloshing around sadly in the absence of toast. The stomach contracts in patterns, especially between meals, and these contractions can contribute to the feeling of hunger. There is also the migrating motor complex, a kind of housekeeping wave in the digestive tract that occurs during periods without food and helps move residual material along. Some of the sensations people interpret as gnawing hunger are related to these normal movements. The stomach is active even when it is not digesting a meal. It is not lying on a chaise longue waiting for your next sandwich. It is doing maintenance. Still, the stomach alone does not create hunger. If it did, eating would be simple and nobody would ever want dessert after a large meal simply because the menu appeared. The brain has a major vote in all this, and the brain is highly interested in reward, anticipation, memory, and sensory cues. This is why you can feel suddenly hungry when you smell bread baking, even if you ate recently. It is why a food advertisement can make a perfectly ordinary afternoon feel like an emergency pastry summit. It is why the sight of someone else eating crisps in a train station can provoke a surprising sense that you too have been denied essential potato-based rights. The brain responds to the idea of food as well as to the need for it. During fasting, this becomes especially noticeable because food is absent but food cues are not. The body may be relying more effectively on stored energy. Blood sugar may be stable enough. Ketones may even be rising. And yet, if someone opens a box of pizza nearby, the mind can still light up with enthusiasm. Hunger is never only metabolic. It is also sensory and emotional. The smell of food, the time of day, the memory of habit, the expectation of pleasure, the social rhythm of meals, all of these can amplify appetite beyond what fuel status alone would predict. This is one reason hunger often feels stronger at some times than at others during fasting, even when the number of hours without food is similar. The midday hunger that arrives when colleagues begin unwrapping lunches may feel much more intense than the hunger at another hour spent alone and distracted. Evening hunger may feel different again, because dinner carries not only nutritional value, but also ritual, comfort, and closure to the day. Meals structure time. They divide the day into recognizable parts. When you fast, you do not only change your energy intake, you alter the emotional architecture of the day. Hunger can therefore be partly about missing food, and partly about missing the moment food usually represents. There's also the blood sugar side of the story, which matters, though not always in the dramatic way people think. When blood glucose falls too low, the body and brain certainly notice. Symptoms can include shakiness, sweating, irritability, dizziness, weakness, and that distinct sensation that everyone around you has suddenly become more annoying than usual. But ordinary hunger during fasting is not always the same as dangerous low blood sugar. In healthy people, the body works hard to keep blood glucose within a useful range during fasting through glycogen breakdown, gluconeogenesis, and later ketone support. Hunger can therefore show up well before true fuel crisis. It may reflect falling insulin, rising ghrelin, mealtime anticipation, and digestive signals more than a dangerous drop in glucose itself. That distinction matters because many people interpret early hunger as a sign that the body is somehow failing or under immediate threat. Sometimes, especially in certain medical conditions or in people taking glucose-lowering medications, fasting really can carry risk and should be approached carefully. But in many healthy people, a wave of hunger simply means the body is adapting, not collapsing. The signal may feel urgent, but urgency is part of how appetite works. Hunger evolved to get your attention. If it were merely a polite suggestion delivered in a low voice from somewhere near the pancreas, many organisms would have wandered off to do something else and forgotten to eat. Hunger is persuasive on purpose. Even so, it is not relentless. One of the most interesting things about hunger during fasting is how often it fades when you do not respond to it immediately. A wave rises, you expect it to intensify forever, but after 20 or 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, it softens. The body has not given up. It has moved into a different pattern. Ghrelin peaks can pass, attention can shift, fat mobilization and ketone availability can improve. The mind can become occupied with other things. This is one reason some people find fasting easier than they expected once they stop treating the first wave of hunger as a final verdict. A wave is not a sentence. It is a moment. Of course, knowing that intellectually and feeling calm in the moment are not always the same. Hunger can be persuasive in deeply personal ways. It has texture. It can feel hollow, sharp, tugging, dull, restless, urgent, or almost emotional. It can make food seem not only appealing but strangely moral, as though a bowl of porridge now represents fairness, decency, and civilization itself. Some of that intensity comes from hormones and sensation. Some comes from reward systems in the brain. Food is not just fuel, it is pleasure, routine, memory, comfort, and social meaning. So when hunger arrives during fasting, it may be pulling on far more than the stomach. Stress makes all of this louder. A stressed body often finds hunger more difficult to interpret and manage. Cortisol influences blood sugar regulation, appetite, and cravings. Poor sleep shifts ghrelin and leptin, often increasing hunger and reducing satiety. Emotional strain can make the idea of fasting feel much harsher because the body is already under load. In that state, appetite can become less a gentle signal and more a demand. Food may feel like relief, not merely nourishment. This is one reason fasting can feel completely different on 2 different days. After good sleep and a calm morning, a person may move through hunger waves quite comfortably. After a bad night, difficult work and general emotional weariness, the very same fasting window may feel intolerable. Hunger is always arriving in context. Leptin deserves a brief mention here too. Often described as a satiety hormone, leptin is produced largely by fat tissue and helps signal long-term energy availability to the brain. It is less about the immediate rise and fall of appetite across a single day and more about the broader state of stored energy. Ghrelin says something like, "Food would be good right now." Leptin says more generally, "This is the overall situation with energy reserves." The brain integrates both kinds of information, along with many others. During fasting, short-term hunger signals may rise even while the body's long-term reserves remain ample. This is another reminder that feeling hungry does not necessarily mean the body has run out of fuel. It means the short-term systems that prompt eating are active. This can be especially confusing for people who are trying fasting for the first time, because they expect the body to be as aware of stored fat as a financial advisor is aware of a savings account. But the brain is dealing with multiple timescales at once. There is the immediate state of the stomach, the learned timing of meals, the hormonal patterns of appetite, the stress context, the sensory environment, and the long-term status of energy stores. Hunger reflects all of these. The fact that the body has access to stored fat does not mean the sensation of hunger disappears at once. The body may know there is money in savings, but it still notices that there is no cash in the till. There is also a very human difference between physiological hunger and what might be called opportunity hunger. Opportunity hunger is what appears when food is available, appealing, or socially expected, even if true metabolic need is modest. You may have eaten recently, but then someone places warm pastries in the room, and suddenly your body begins speaking as if it has been abandoned in the wilderness. This is not weakness. It is the brain responding to reward and opportunity. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. Energy-dense food has long been worth noticing. The modern world simply floods us with those cues all day long, which makes appetite a rather busy business. During fasting, opportunity hunger can be one of the most challenging parts. The body may be handling the lack of food reasonably well, but the environment keeps advertising alternatives. Smells, rituals, kitchen habits, break times, family meals, coffee shops, even boredom all create invitations. This is part of why fasting is never purely biochemical. It is lived socially. Hunger comes not only from within, but also from the world. A person fasting in a quiet environment may experience one set of hunger waves. The same person fasting while preparing meals for others, walking past bakeries, or attending long office meetings with bowls of biscuits may experience quite another. The body and brain are reading cues together. The wave pattern becomes clearer when people observe it over time. Morning hunger may arrive near the usual breakfast hour, then fade. Midday hunger may be more pronounced because lunch is socially and hormonally well rehearsed. Afternoon may feel oddly easier, especially if ketones are rising and the body is more fully settled into using stored fuel. Evening may bring another wave, not only because of appetite, but because dinner often carries emotional meaning. Then, surprisingly, the hunger may soften again. This rhythm can seem strange until you realize the body is not simply measuring emptiness. It is cycling through signals, expectations, and adaptive responses. There is a great deal of comfort in realizing that hunger can pass without being immediately obeyed. Not because the goal should always be to ignore it. Hunger is a valuable signal. There are many times when listening to it is entirely wise, but understanding that it moves in waves gives people more room. A strong moment of appetite does not automatically mean the body's in trouble. It may mean a hormone pulse is peaking. It may mean lunchtime is near. It may mean you are tired and your brain is interpreting food as comfort. It may mean a bakery has made itself impossible to ignore. Hunger is informative, but it is not always literal. That said, there are also forms of hunger that deserve more caution. If fasting produces lightheadedness, tremors, confusion, weakness, nausea, or symptoms that suggest more than ordinary appetite, the body may be asking for something more serious. People with diabetes, especially those using insulin or medications that affect blood sugar, need to be particularly careful. Pregnant people, growing children, individuals with eating disorders or a history of them, and those with certain medical conditions should not treat hunger as a casual experiment. Biology remains practical. Signals matter. The point is not that hunger should always be ignored. The point is that ordinary hunger during fasting often behaves rhythmically rather than catastrophically. One of the most fascinating changes happens when the body becomes more accustomed to fasting. The same hunger waves may arrive, but often with less force. Mealtime anticipation can adjust. Ghrelin rhythms can shift. The person learns that a wave can rise and pass. The body becomes more comfortable accessing stored fuel. The brain stops interpreting every missed meal as a pending legal dispute. Over time, hunger can become less frightening and more legible. It is still there, but it reads more like information and less like panic. Adaptation changes the emotional texture of the signal. This is where the phrase, "why you feel hungry," becomes more layered than it first appears. You feel hungry because hormones are pulsing, because the stomach is active, because the brain expects a meal, because blood sugar and insulin are changing, because food cues are present, because habits are strong, because stress magnifies appetite, because sleep loss makes everything louder, because your body has evolved to make eating difficult to forget, and because the body still likes regular nourishment even while it knows how to manage without it for a while. Hunger is not one thing. It is several systems speaking at once, and perhaps that is why it can feel so personal. Different people have different hunger patterns, not only because their metabolism differs, but because their histories differ. Childhood meal routines, dieting experiences, emotional associations with food, work schedules, sleep habits, and culture all shape the meaning of appetite. For one person, hunger may feel almost clean and physical. For another, it may feel entangled with anxiety, comfort, rebellion, or habit. Fasting does not create those layers, but it can reveal them. In the absence of food, the body's signals become easier to notice, and sometimes the mind's habits become easier to notice too. There is a small irony in this. People often begin fasting to understand the body better, expecting to learn mainly about fat burning, insulin, or metabolism. And they do learn those things, but they also often end up learning about time, routine, emotion, and the mind's relationship to food. Hunger becomes a teacher, though sometimes a rather nagging one. It shows how much of appetite is biological and how much is patterned. It reveals that the body is neither helpless nor silent. It speaks in rhythms, it speaks in waves, it speaks loudly enough to be heard, but not always literally enough to be taken at face value. By this point in fasting, the body is doing a great deal behind the scenes. Glycogen has been used, fatty acids are circulating, ketones are beginning to support the brain. Hunger is rising and fading in patterned pulses, but all of this is being coordinated by something even more fundamental than appetite itself. Hormones are directing the transitions. They tell tissues when to store, when to release, when to spare, when to mobilize, and how to keep the whole operation running without the arrival of another meal. Hunger may be the feeling you notice most clearly, but underneath it lies a deeper chemical choreography, and that is where the story of fasting becomes even more interesting. If fasting were only about the absence of food, it would be much easier to describe. You stop eating, the stomach empties, the body uses stored energy, and there we are. Neat, tidy, biologically respectable. But the body's never that simple, and certainly not when it comes to energy. Fasting is not just a matter of less food. It is a matter of changing signals. The body does not merely notice that a meal has not arrived and shrug with polite concern. It responds through hormones, those chemical messengers that carry instructions from one tissue to another, adjusting everything from blood sugar to appetite to fuel release to mental state. During fasting, hormones are in constant motion. They are the ones deciding what kind of fuel should be used, how strongly hunger should be felt, whether stored energy should be opened up, and how to keep the whole system running while no new food is arriving. If metabolism is the orchestra, hormones are very much the conductor, though at times one suspects they're all arguing over the tempo. Two of the most important hormones in this part of the story are insulin and ghrelin. They are not the only ones involved, not by a long stretch, but they are among the clearest and most familiar. Insulin helps govern what happens after eating, especially how nutrients are stored and how glucose is handled. Ghrelin helps shape hunger and meal anticipation. Together they tell us something essential about fasting. The chemistry of not eating is not passive. The body does not simply wait. It shifts instructions. It changes its priorities. It moves from storage toward release, from incoming supply toward internal management, and from meal handling toward interval survival. These shifts are hormonal before they are experiential. You may notice hunger, mood, or energy. But underneath all of that, the chemistry is already moving. Insulin is a good place to begin because it sits so close to the center of modern conversations about food and is so often discussed with either excessive blame or excessive reverence. In reality, insulin is a practical hormone doing practical work. It is released by the pancreas, mainly in response to rising blood glucose after a meal, though protein and other signals can influence it too. Its job is not to punish you for enjoying potatoes. Its job is to help tissues take up glucose, to regulate blood sugar, and to encourage the storage of energy when food is available. In the fed state, insulin says something like this: nutrients are arriving. Let us use what we need and store what we should. It helps the liver store glycogen. It helps muscle and fat tissue respond to incoming fuel. It keeps glucose from staying too high in the blood where it would become harmful. Without insulin, the body would be in serious trouble. That is worth stating because popular food culture often speaks of insulin as though it were a villain hiding behind every slice of bread wearing a waistcoat and making bad decisions. But insulin is essential. The issue is not whether insulin exists. The issue is how much, how often, in what pattern, and how responsive tissues are to it. In a healthy fed state, insulin rises, does its work, and then falls as digestion fades. That rise and fall is normal. It is one of the ways the body marks the difference between eating and not eating. This is why fasting changes so much once insulin begins to come down. As long as insulin remains elevated, the body is still leaning towards storage. It is still dealing with incoming nutrients. It is still relatively restrained in its willingness to release stored energy. When insulin falls, that restraint eases. Fat cells become more able to release fatty acids. The liver becomes more active in supporting blood glucose from internal sources. The body shifts away from saying food is here, let us save some, and towards saying food is absent, let us use what we have. A great deal of fasting physiology begins with that hormonal shift. In this sense, fasting is not simply low food, it is low insulin compared with the fed state. That does not mean zero insulin. The body almost never deals in absolutes that neat. But it does mean that the hormonal environment becomes less focused on storage and more open to fuel mobilization. This matters because insulin influences several pathways at once. It suppresses lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat. It affects liver glucose output. It shapes how tissues partition fuels. When it falls, multiple doors open. The body becomes more metabolically flexible. It starts acting like a household that knows the grocery delivery is not arriving and has therefore begun consulting the pantry with seriousness and grace. The pace at which insulin falls depends on many things. Meal size matters. Meal composition matters. A large mixed meal will shape the insulin response differently than a light one. A meal high in refined carbohydrate may produce a different rise and fall than one with more fibre, fat, and protein. Activity matters too. If you move after eating, muscles may take up more glucose and the whole curve may look different. Insulin sensitivity matters perhaps most of all. A body that responds efficiently to insulin may handle the transition from fed to fasted state more smoothly than one that is more resistant to its signal. This is one reason fasting does not feel the same for everyone. Hormones are not only present, they are present in different landscapes. Now, while insulin is easing downward, ghrelin begins making itself known in the far more personal language of appetite. Ghrelin is often introduced as the hunger hormone, which is broadly true, but also a bit unfairly narrow. Ghrelin is not just a hunger siren, it is a timing signal. It rises before meals, tends to fall after eating, and plays a part in meal initiation, appetite, and food-seeking behaviour. One of the most interesting things about ghrelin is how much it responds to routine. If you eat breakfast every day at the same hour, ghrelin learns that hour. It begins to rise in expectation. It prepares the body and brain. If the meal then fails to appear, the signal may still come. This is one reason hunger during fasting can feel so patterned. Ghrelin is not merely reacting to empty energy reserves. It is participating in a learned rhythm. That rhythm makes hunger seem far more dramatic than the body's actual fuel status might justify. A person may have ample stored energy, falling insulin, rising fat mobilization, and a liver doing excellent work, yet still experience a very convincing wave of hunger at the usual lunch hour. The chemistry behind that wave is real. Ghrelin is rising. The stomach may be contracting. The brain is paying attention. But the message is not necessarily you are in immediate trouble. Often it's closer to food usually happens now, and I would quite like it if that continued. Ghrelin speaks with confidence, but not always with absolute literalness. One of the reasons ghrelin matters so much in fasting is that it reveals how appetite is shaped by time as much as by need. We often imagine hunger as a fuel gauge, but ghrelin makes it clear that appetite is also a clock. It rises in pulses. It can come and go. It can be strong, then fade. This is why fasting often feels hardest at familiar meal times and surprisingly manageable in the gaps between them. The hunger wave is hormonal, not linear. It peaks, passes, and returns according to pattern. People sometimes discover this with a bit of amazement the first time they do not eat at the usual hour, and notice that the hunger, rather than climbing forever, eventually softens. Ghrelin is part of that. It surges. It settles. It does not simply keep climbing towards some catastrophic summit of pastry-related despair. This wave pattern is not only useful to understand, it is emotionally useful too. Once a person realizes that hunger often has rhythm, it becomes easier to experience it without immediately treating it as a command. A wave can be observed, even if not always comfortably. It can rise without requiring instant obedience. That does not mean ignoring hunger is always wise. Hunger is a valuable signal and should not be treated with contempt. But understanding its hormonal basis gives it context. It becomes information rather than doom. Alongside insulin and ghrelin, several other hormones are deeply involved in fasting, even if they tend to receive less public attention. Glycogen is one of the most important. Produced by the pancreas, glycogen often acts in ways that balance insulin. When insulin is higher, glycogen tends to be less dominant. When insulin falls during fasting, glycogen becomes more influential. Its main role is to help keep blood glucose available by signaling the liver to break down glycogen, and later to support gluconeogenesis. If insulin says store and use incoming fuel, glycogen says release and make fuel now that the meal is gone. The two are not enemies, they are more like shift workers. One handles the fed state, the other steps in as fasting progresses. This handoff matters enormously, because the body must still protect blood glucose even while moving toward greater fat use. The brain still needs support. Certain tissues still require glucose, so glucagon helps preserve continuity. It is one of the chemical reasons you can go hours without food and still think, move, speak, and conduct mildly unnecessary internet searches about whether sparkling water counts as a hobby. The body is not waiting for food to resume function. It is using glucagon and other signals to maintain function in the meantime. Adrenaline and noradrenaline also have roles to play. These catecholamines are often associated with alertness and stress, and rightly so, but they also help mobilize fuel. During fasting, especially as the body begins leaning more on stored energy, catecholamines can help stimulate lipolysis and support the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. They also influence alertness. This is one reason some people do not feel sleepy when fasting, but oddly awake. Again, not universally, not magically, and not always pleasantly. Sometimes it feels like clean alertness. Sometimes it feels like you are a little too aware of both your inbox and the existence of almonds. But the point is that fasting does not necessarily make the body sluggish at once. Hormonal patterns are helping keep fuel available and attention somewhat sharpened. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes perfect sense. It would be inconvenient if every period without food immediately turned an organism into a drowsy decorative object, incapable of finding the next meal. Some increase in alertness, some willingness to mobilize energy, some capacity to stay engaged while food is absent. All of that would be adaptive. Catecholamines help support that state. They are part of why fasting can feel mentally bright for some people, especially once the body is handling the fuel shift well. Of course, in a stressed or sleep-deprived person, the same hormonal effects may feel less like elegant alertness and more like being slightly over-caffeinated in a room with poor lighting. Context, again, determines mood. Cortisol is another important player, though it is often discussed in tones that suggest it has committed a personal offence. Cortisol is a stress hormone, yes, but also a normal and necessary part of daily physiology. It follows a circadian rhythm, generally rising in the morning to help wake you and prepare the body for the day. It also influences glucose regulation and energy availability. During fasting, cortisol may help support blood glucose through its effects on gluconeogenesis and tissue metabolism. This is part of the body's broader effort to keep the system running when food is absent. The problem is not that cortisol exists. The problem is when overall stress load becomes too high. Fasting in a calm, well-rested body may involve a manageable hormonal adaptation. Fasting in a body already overloaded by sleep loss, emotional strain, illness, excessive exercise, or chronic stress may feel much harsher because cortisol and other stress systems are already elevated. In that state, the chemistry of not eating can push the body toward irritation rather than resilience. Hunger may feel more urgent, mood may worsen, sleep may become lighter. The experience changes because the hormonal backdrop has changed. This is why fasting should never be discussed, as though it happens in a vacuum. The hormones involved are not responding to food alone, they are responding to the whole organism. Sleep affects ghrelin and leptin. Stress affects cortisol and insulin sensitivity. Exercise affects catecholamines, glycogen use, and fuel demand. Circadian rhythm affects all of it. Even light exposure can influence the hormonal landscape in ways that shape appetite and energy. The body is not isolating fasting as a neat experiment. It is integrating it into everything else that is already happening. Leptin deserves more attention here than it usually gets. Produced mainly by fat tissue, leptin helps signal the brain about longer-term energy availability. It is often described as a satiety hormone, though that too is a simplification. Leptin says something broader than I am full right now. It says more like, these are the energy reserves we are working with overall. In a body with adequate fat stores, leptin helps reassure the brain that long-term energy status is acceptable. During fasting, especially if repeated or prolonged, leptin levels can fall. That drop may be part of the body's way of registering reduced intake and changing its broader energy strategy. Over time, lower leptin can increase appetite and influence metabolic adaptation. In other words, the body does not only notice missed meals in the short term, it also updates its sense of overall energy pattern. Leptin and ghrelin together help show why appetite is not just a daily event. There is short-term appetite shaped by meal timing and immediate fasting chemistry, and there is longer-term appetite shaped by overall energy status. The brain integrates both. It asks not only, has lunch arrived, but also, what is the general state of reserves? That integration is not always neat, and in modern life it is often distorted by habits, processed food, sleep disruption, and chronic over- or underfeeding. But the principle remains. The chemistry of not eating happens on several timescales at once. There are also changes in growth hormone during fasting, which are particularly interesting. Growth hormone, despite the name, is not only about growing children or bodybuilders making questionable decisions in locker rooms. It also has important roles in metabolism, tissue repair, and fuel regulation. During fasting, growth hormone levels can rise. One reason for this may be to help preserve lean tissue while supporting fat use. The body is trying to avoid burning through protein unnecessarily. Growth hormone appears to be part of that protective strategy. It is one more reminder that fasting is not simply about subtraction, it is about reorganization. The body changes the hormonal environment to conserve what matters and use what is available. This conservation strategy is one of the most elegant parts of fasting biology. When food stops coming in, the body does not simply start tearing through everything at random, like a child opening kitchen cupboards after school. It changes the hormonal instructions so that stored fat becomes more available, glucose is protected, the brain gets support, and lean tissue is spared as much as possible. Insulin falls. Glycogen rises in importance. Catecholamines help mobilize fuel. Growth hormone helps preserve structure. Ghrelin announces meal times with varying degrees of theatrical conviction. Leptin updates the longer picture. Cortisol helps coordinate the stress of the interval. The chemistry of not eating is therefore not a silence, it is a reorchestration. This reorchestration also changes how full or empty you feel mentally. Appetite is not only about wanting food. Hormones influence mood, patience, reward sensitivity, and even social tolerance. Anyone who has ever been hungry and briefly considered that everyone else in the supermarket might be moving with unusual incompetence has already experienced this. Blood sugar stability matters. Ghrelin may influence not only appetite, but broader brain systems related to reward and motivation. Cortisol changes emotional tone. Catecholamines alter alertness. So when fasting feels calm, edgy, focused, or irritable, that is not simply personality on parade. It is chemistry with opinions. The fascinating thing is that these hormonal patterns can adapt. A person who regularly fasts for a certain window may develop different ghrelin rhythms. Hunger may arise less intensely at former meal times. Insulin responses may become more manageable. Fat mobilization may become smoother. The body learns patterns. It does not freeze its chemistry on one setting forever. This is why fasting that feels difficult at first may feel more ordinary later, though not always and not for everyone. Hormones are responsive. They are not fixed characters in a play. They change according to repeated experience. Still, it is wise not to romanticize adaptation too much. The body can adapt to many things that are not necessarily ideal in every context. A person can become used to chronic stress, poor sleep, or erratic eating, and still be paying a price for it. So while hormonal adaptation can make fasting easier, easier does not always mean better in every case. The body's willingness to cope is not proof that it is thriving. That is why all of this needs context. Hormones can tell a body to endure a lot. The question is always whether the environment supports that endurance in a healthy way. What becomes increasingly clear in fasting is that hormones are the great translators between absence and action. Food does not arrive, so hormones reinterpret the world. They shift the body from receiving mode to reserve mode. They shape how hunger feels. They decide when fat can be released. They maintain blood glucose. They influence the brain's tone and the body's priorities. If fasting is a pause in eating, hormones are what make that pause metabolically legible. Without them, the body would simply be missing meals. With them, the body can adapt. And yet, all of this chemical sophistication serves a very practical question. Once insulin has fallen, ghrelin has announced itself, glucagon is active, catecholamines are helping mobilize fat, and the body is clearly operating in a different hormonal world. What exactly does that world accomplish at the cellular level? How do these shifting signals change what cells actually do when there is no incoming food? And what does that mean for the body's own maintenance and repair? One of the reasons fasting has gathered so much fascination over the years is that at some point the conversation usually leaves ordinary things like hunger, blood sugar, and fat metabolism and enters a more mysterious territory. This is the point where people begin speaking in hushed voices about cellular cleanup, as though every skipped meal causes tiny maintenance crews to emerge wearing overalls and carrying miniature brooms. The truth is less theatrical, but not less interesting. During fasting, the body does not only change how it gets energy, it also changes what it prioritizes inside cells. When nutrients are not constantly arriving, the body shifts away from growth and storage mode and leans more toward maintenance, conservation, and internal housekeeping. One of the most important processes associated with that shift is autophagy. Autophagy is one of those biological words that sounds more alarming than it really is. It comes from Greek roots meaning self-eating, which is admittedly not the most soothing phrase to hear while trying to relax. It sounds like the sort of thing that ought to be whispered in a laboratory at midnight while lightning flickers in the background. But in biology, autophagy is not a horror story. It is a normal cellular process. It is part of how cells identify worn-out or damaged components, break them down, and recycle their parts. It is less like a cell eating itself in despair, and more like a tidy workshop sorting through old tools, broken machinery, and spare parts to keep everything running properly. Cells are busy places. They are full of proteins being built and broken down, membranes being maintained, organelles doing specialized jobs, and countless chemical reactions taking place every second. Over time, parts wear out, proteins become damaged or misfolded, mitochondria can become less efficient, cellular components accumulate wear from ordinary metabolism, oxidative stress, and the general fact that being alive involves a great deal of chemical traffic. If cells simply kept every old part forever, the whole system would become cluttered and dysfunctional. So cells have quality control mechanisms. They inspect, repair, remove, and recycle. Autophagy is one of the main ways they do that. What fasting seems to do, at least under the right conditions, is shift the body toward greater use of this maintenance mode. When nutrients are plentiful, especially when amino acids and insulin are high, the body is more focused on growth, building, and storage. That makes sense. Food is here. Resources are coming in. It is a good time to construct, replace, expand, and signal abundance. When food is absent for a while, those signals change. The body becomes less interested in growth and more interested in efficiency. It begins asking a different question. Instead of what shall we build next, it asks what do we already have that can be repaired, recycled, or used more wisely. This shift is governed by nutrient-sensing pathways inside cells, and one of the most important is something called mTOR, short for mechanistic target of rapamycin. This is one of those names that sounds as if it ought to belong either to a medieval fortress or a particularly dramatic fantasy villain. But in fact, it is a protein complex involved in regulating cell growth, protein synthesis, and nutrient sensing. When nutrients are abundant, especially amino acids and growth signals, mTOR activity tends to be higher. That promotes building and growth. When nutrients are scarce, mTOR activity falls, and other pathways associated with energy conservation and maintenance become more active. One of those is AMPK, a kind of cellular energy sensor that responds when energy is relatively low. Together, these pathways help cells decide whether the moment calls for expansion or cleanup. This is where fasting becomes interesting at the cellular level. It is not merely withholding calories and forcing the body to burn stored fuel. It is changing the messages cells receive about the state of the environment. The message shifts from abundance to pause, from build freely to be efficient, from store and expand to maintain and recycle. Under those conditions, autophagy tends to increase. Damaged proteins may be broken down. Dysfunctional components may be packaged into structures called autophagosomes, which then fuse with lysosomes where the contents are degraded and recycled. Useful molecules are recovered. Waste is removed. The cell becomes, in a sense, more selective about what it keeps. There is something deeply sensible about this. If food is not coming in, it is a good time to look around the workshop and deal with the clutter. It is a good time to take old parts off the shelf, sort what still works, recycle what does not, and stop pretending the drawer full of bent screws and mysterious cords is part of a long-term strategy. Cells, like people, benefit from not hoarding useless bits forever. The difference is that cells tend to be much better at this than most kitchen junk drawers. Still, it is very easy to over-romanticize autophagy, and modern fasting culture sometimes does exactly that. The process is real and important, but it is often described as if fasting flips on a magical deep clean button and suddenly all cells begin polishing themselves like silverware before a holiday dinner. Biology is rarely that tidy. Autophagy is not simply off when you eat, and on when you fast. It happens at baseline too. Cells are always doing some level of maintenance. What changes during fasting is the balance and intensity of signalling. Certain conditions can make autophagy more active, but this depends on timing, tissue, nutrient status, stress, and broader context. The body is not running one giant synchronized cleaning program with a whistle and clipboard. Different tissues respond differently. Different forms of fasting produce different effects. The process is nuanced. That nuance matters because people often want very precise answers to a process that is influenced by many variables. They ask exactly how many hours it takes for autophagy to start, as though it were a train leaving a platform at a published time. But biology does not work that way. There is no single universal hour mark at which the entire body officially declares, "Now we are cleaning." Autophagy is already part of normal cellular life. What fasting does is gradually change the conditions that can promote it. The longer and deeper the nutrient pause, the more likely the maintenance-oriented signaling becomes significant in some tissues. But the exact timeline depends on the individual, the previous meals, overall energy status, activity, hormones, and the tissue being discussed. The liver is not identical to muscle. Muscle is not identical to brain. The body does not keep one timetable for all organs. Even so, the general principle holds. Fasting shifts the body away from constant incoming supply and toward internal management. Some of that management involves using stored fuel. Some of it involves preserving blood sugar. Some of it involves hormonal changes. And some of it involves cellular cleanup. The idea is not that fasting creates autophagy from nothing. The idea is that fasting is one of the conditions under which the body becomes more likely to prioritize repair and recycling over growth and storage. In that sense, fasting can be thought of as a maintenance interval, not because every fast is automatically cleansing in some grand mystical way, but because the body responds to the absence of nutrients by changing what it focuses on. The appeal of that idea is obvious. It is comforting to think that while you're not eating, something quietly useful is happening beyond the ordinary inconvenience of appetite. And to be fair, something useful often is happening. The body is not merely enduring the absence of food, it is reallocating resources. But here too, context matters. Fasting is not the only thing that influences autophagy. Exercise can influence it. Sleep affects repair and maintenance profoundly. Overall nutrition matters. Chronic stress can complicate everything. And severe deprivation is not the same as strategic maintenance. A moderate fasting interval in a healthy body is one thing. Prolonged undernourishment or starvation is quite another. The body's maintenance systems are helpful, but they are not a justification for endless deprivation. Cleanup is useful. Demolition is not. One of the most interesting aspects of autophagy is that it helps explain why the body may benefit from not being in constant growth mode all the time. Modern life, at least in food-rich environments, often encourages near-constant feeding. Breakfast, snacks, lunch, more snacks, dinner, dessert. Perhaps a late evening raid on the kitchen under the emotional justification that the day was long and therefore biscuits are now medicinal. Under such conditions, the body spends a great deal of time handling incoming nutrients, releasing insulin, processing amino acids, and maintaining a more fed state pattern. There is nothing inherently wrong with eating regularly, of course, but it does mean that periods of metabolic pause become rarer. Fasting, even in simple overnight form, creates a gap in that pattern. It gives the body time in which it is not immediately occupied with digesting, absorbing, and storing. That gap may be part of what allows maintenance processes to become more prominent. This is also why sleep is such an important partner in ordinary daily fasting. During the night, you are not eating, not digesting fresh meals, and not usually making complicated decisions about sandwiches. The body has a stretch of hours in which it can focus on other tasks. Some of those tasks involve the brain, hormones, memory processing, and immune function. Some involve cellular repair and maintenance. The overnight fast is not glamorous, but it is biologically elegant. You stop eating, go unconscious for a while, and the body uses the interval for regulation. It is perhaps the least dramatic and most successful fasting protocol imaginable. At the cellular level, maintenance is not only about removing old parts, it is also about resilience. Cells that can identify and clear damaged components are generally better able to function over time. A damaged protein left lying around is not just clutter, it can interfere with other processes. A poorly functioning mitochondrion is not merely tired. It may produce more reactive oxygen species and contribute to further damage, so quality control matters. Cells need to know not just how to build, but how to edit. They need to know when to be constructive and when to be selective. Fasting seems to be one of the signals that tilts the balance towards selectivity. This has helped fuel scientific interest in autophagy's possible role in aging, neurodegenerative disease, metabolic health, and overall cellular resilience. Researchers are interested in whether impaired autophagy contributes to the accumulation of damaged proteins and dysfunctional organelles seen in aging and certain diseases. That is a serious and important area of study, but it is easy to run ahead of the evidence and begin making sweeping claims that fasting will somehow scrub away all future disease like a particularly responsible housekeeper. Biology is seldom so generous. Autophagy is promising and important, but it is one process among many. It is not a universal cure, and fasting is not the only thing that influences health outcomes. Still, the fact that the body has built-in systems for self-maintenance and that fasting can influence those systems is undeniably fascinating. There is also something conceptually satisfying about autophagy, because it reminds us that health is not only about adding things. Modern wellness culture often focuses on inputs: more protein, more supplements, more antioxidants, more habits, more scheduling, more things stacked on top of one another until daily life begins to resemble a laboratory run by a highly organized squirrel. But the body also depends on subtraction. It depends on removing what no longer works. It depends on recycling, clearing, pruning, and making space. Fasting participates in that logic of subtraction. It creates a condition in which the body is less occupied with handling new arrivals and more able to attend to old material. That principle appears in many parts of biology, not just metabolism. The brain prunes synapses. The immune system clears damaged cells. Bone is constantly remodeled. Skin sheds and renews. The body is not static. It remains healthy by turning over parts of itself in an orderly way. Autophagy belongs to that broader theme. It is one of the ways life stays functional, not by preserving every component forever, but by replacing, reusing, and removing what has become inefficient. Fasting, in turn, can be one of the situations that nudges the body toward that quieter mode of order. This does not mean that more fasting always means more benefit. That is where enthusiasm can become unhelpful. Autophagy is adaptive, but the body still needs nutrients. It still needs protein for tissues, essential fats, vitamins, minerals, and overall energy to sustain itself over time. Maintenance mode cannot be the only mode. A house cannot thrive if all you do is sort the cupboards and never bring in groceries. At some point, building, replenishment, and nourishment must return. Healthy metabolism depends on rhythm, not one endless state. Feeding and fasting, growth and repair, input and cleanup. The body needs both sides of the cycle. This rhythm may be one of the most useful ways to think about fasting, not as a superior state and not as punishment, but as one part of a pattern. When you eat, the body has the opportunity to build, replenish glycogen, synthesize proteins, and support active function. When you pause, the body has the opportunity to draw on reserves, shift signals, and increase maintenance. The value lies not in choosing one side forever, but in allowing both sides to exist when appropriate. Constant feeding can crowd out some aspects of maintenance. Constant fasting can crowd out replenishment. The body, wise as ever, prefers alternation. There is a deeper psychological resonance here too, even if the cells themselves are not especially interested in metaphor. We tend to imagine rest as inactivity, but the body repeatedly teaches a different lesson. Sleep is not nothing, it is active restoration. Recovery is not laziness, it is preparation. A pause in eating is not merely absence, it can be a period of reorganization. Autophagy fits that lesson neatly. When nothing new is coming in, the body does not necessarily sit idle. Sometimes it gets to work on things that are harder to address when life is full of incoming material. The quiet interval becomes useful. One of the reasons this part of fasting feels so appealing is that it happens largely out of sight. You cannot feel autophagy in the way you can feel hunger. There is no clear bodily sensation that says, "Ah yes, my lysosomes are having a very productive afternoon." What you feel is usually the outer layer of fasting. Appetite, mood, energy, focus, perhaps lightness, or irritation, or calm. The cellular maintenance beneath that is invisible. Perhaps that is why it lends itself so easily to mythology. Anything invisible invites fantasy. But the real story is good enough without fantasy. Cells have systems for quality control. Fasting changes nutrient signals. Those changed signals can support greater maintenance and recycling. That is already a wonderfully elegant piece of biology. At the same time, it is wise to remember that cleanup is not the only thing happening. While autophagy may be increasing in certain ways, the body is also balancing blood sugar, using fatty acids, producing ketones, shifting hormones, and managing the emotional complications of hunger in a world filled with food cues. Fasting is never one process. It is always a bundle of adaptations happening at once. Autophagy is one thread in a much larger tapestry. Important, yes, but not the whole picture. There is also an irony worth noticing. People are often most interested in autophagy at exactly the moment when fasting starts to feel hardest. Hunger waves may still come, energy may wobble, the day may begin to feel longer than usual, and yet beneath those ordinary discomforts, the body may be doing some of its most practical housekeeping. The visible experience can feel inconvenient while the invisible biology remains useful. This is very much in keeping with the body's personality. Some of its best work is performed without fanfare, and with very little concern for whether you find the process aesthetically pleasing. In the end, what fasting reveals here is not that the body needs to be constantly forced into clean-up mode, but that it already knows how to care for itself when conditions allow. It has maintenance systems, it has nutrient sensors, it has ways of deciding when to build and when to sort. Fasting in the right context gives those systems more room to operate. That is not magic, it is design. The body is not passively waiting for food to return. It is cleaning the workshop, checking the machinery, reusing what can be reused, and making sure the place does not fill up with broken parts simply because no one bothered to stop the assembly line for a while. And while those quiet maintenance processes continue in the background, the lived experience of fasting remains much more immediate. Cells may be recycling old components with admirable efficiency, but the person doing the fasting is still living through the day in real time, with all the practical questions that brings. Does energy feel steady or strange? Does focus improve or wobble? Does mood sharpen, soften, or become oddly attached to the idea of soup? The next part of the story moves back from the cellular workshop to the more personal terrain of attention, emotion, and the surprisingly mixed ways fasting can feel when translated into ordinary human consciousness. One of the oddest things about fasting is that it can feel surprisingly different from what people expect. Before trying it, many imagine one of two extremes. Either they picture some glowing state of perfect concentration, as if skipping lunch will transform the mind into a calm and luminous engine of wisdom, productivity, and suspiciously good life choices. Or they picture the opposite, a miserable collapse into weakness, irritability, and the kind of low-energy fog usually associated with poor sleep, delayed trains, and unfortunate customer service calls. The truth, as usual, is more mixed and more human. Fasting can feel strangely clear. It can also feel genuinely difficult. Sometimes it feels both in the same day. And the reason has less to do with simple willpower than with how the body and brain are handling a changing fuel environment, a changing hormonal landscape, and a very old biological situation being lived inside a very modern life. By this point in the fasting story, a great deal has already happened under the surface. Glycogen has been used. The body has begun shifting more heavily towards stored fat. Ketones are starting to support the brain more meaningfully. Hunger hormones have been rising and falling in waves. Nutrient-sensing pathways inside cells have shifted toward more maintenance-oriented priorities. All of that is real, and all of it influences how fasting feels. But feeling is never just chemistry. It is chemistry, meeting a mind, a body, a history, a schedule, and a day. That is why one person may describe fasting as calm and clarifying, while another experiences it as distracting and rough. The biology matters. The context matters just as much. Let us begin with the clearer side of the experience, because it is one of the things people often find most surprising. Some report that after the early hunger has passed, and the body has begun settling into a more stable use of stored fuel, their energy feels steadier. Not necessarily higher in the dramatic sense, not like having swallowed a motivational speech and half a trumpet section, but steadier. There may be less of the rise and fall feeling that comes with frequent eating, especially if a person is used to meals or snacks that produce noticeable swings in blood sugar and appetite. The body, relying more on internal reserves and with ketones beginning to support the brain, can feel less tied to the immediate arrival of the next meal. There is a kind of continuity in that. The mind may stop checking the clock so nervously. The body may stop asking every hour what the catering situation is. That steadiness can create a feeling of clarity. Some people find that their thoughts feel less cluttered. Focus seems easier to hold. There is less heaviness after meals because, of course, there is no meal currently being digested. The body is not diverting quite so much attention toward processing a large breakfast or lunch. The brain is not dealing with the same post-meal shifts in glucose and insulin. The day can feel simpler. This can be especially noticeable if someone is used to eating in a way that makes them sleepy or sluggish afterwards. Remove the meal or delay it, and suddenly the contrast becomes obvious. The mind feels cleaner not because fasting has made it superhuman, but because one familiar source of post-meal drag is absent. There is also the possibility that ketones contribute to this sense of mental steadiness. As discussed earlier, the brain can use ketones as fuel once they rise sufficiently, and for some people, this seems to feel different from relying more heavily on glucose alone. The experience may be one of calm alertness rather than the sharp push and drop some associate with frequent carbohydrate-heavy eating. Again, not universal, not mystical, and certainly not proof that everyone should immediately reorganize their lives around delayed lunch. But it is a genuine pattern for many. The brain, supplied by a more stable internal fuel stream, can feel less volatile. Another part of the clarity may be psychological rather than strictly metabolic. Meals and snacks, lovely as they are, break the day into episodes. There is planning, choosing, preparing, eating, clearing, perhaps regretting the second pastry, perhaps wishing for a third. Fasting removes some of that. Not eating for a while can make the day feel simpler. Fewer choices, fewer interruptions, less negotiation. For some minds, that simplicity is a relief. They are not only experiencing a different fuel state, they are experiencing fewer decision points. The absence of food can create a surprising mental spaciousness, especially in people whose usual eating patterns involve a great deal of low-level planning or temptation. There is perhaps also an older biological logic underneath all this. In an environment where food was not always available on demand, It would not have been very useful if the first several hours without food always turned a person into an exhausted sofa ornament, incapable of thought or movement. Some degree of maintained alertness during fasting would be adaptive. A body that can stay focused long enough to seek food has an advantage over one that immediately dissolves into confusion and self-pity. Hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline likely play a role in this alertness, helping to mobilize fuel and keep the system responsive. So when fasting feels mentally sharp for some people, part of what they may be experiencing is the body's old capacity to remain engaged when external fuel is absent. Still, this is only one side of the story, and it would be a mistake to present it as the default or the goal. Because fasting can also feel genuinely difficult. It can feel distracting, draining, and emotionally uncomfortable in ways that are every bit as real as the calm clarity some people describe. Hunger itself is one obvious reason. A body can be metabolically competent and still be quite vocal about the fact that no food has arrived. Hunger thoughts can narrow attention. Even if the brain has enough fuel overall, part of that brain may still be devoting considerable energy to noticing that lunch is not happening. It is hard to feel spiritually elevated when your mind keeps interrupting itself to suggest toast. Mood can become sharper in less flattering ways too. Irritability is a common companion to fasting, especially early on, or in people whose bodies are not yet comfortable with the transition. There is even that modern term, hangry, which is silly but useful because it names something recognizably real. When energy intake is delayed and hunger signals are strong, patience can wear thin. Other people may seem slower. Small inconveniences may feel less small. The email that would normally be mildly annoying can suddenly feel like a personal insult, arranged by history itself. This is not always a sign of deep truth. It is often a sign of appetite, shifting hormones, and a brain that has less tolerance than usual for nonsense. Part of that irritability may reflect the stress side of fasting. Although fasting can be manageable and even beneficial in some contexts, it is still a demand on the body. It changes hormones. It requires adaptation. If the body is already under strain from poor sleep, emotional stress, illness, hard training, or general overload, fasting may not feel clarifying at all. It may feel like one more thing to cope with. The same hormonal systems that help keep the body alert can tip toward feeling edgy when the broader stress burden is high. A little fasting stress in a rested body may feel energizing. The same fasting stress in an exhausted body may feel punishing. That difference is essential. Sleep is especially important here. A sleep-deprived body is simply worse at many things, and one of those things is handling fasting gracefully. Poor sleep affects hunger hormones, often raising ghrelin and lowering leptin in ways that make appetite stronger and satiety weaker. It affects insulin sensitivity, which can alter how stable energy feels. It affects cortisol and emotional regulation. A tired brain is less patient, less resilient, and more likely to seek food as quick relief. So fasting after a good night's sleep may feel calm and manageable, while fasting after fragmented, poor, or too little sleep may feel like a terrible idea whispered by someone who has never had responsibilities. There is also the simple fact that fuel transitions are not always smooth. When the body is shifting from glycogen dependence toward greater reliance on fatty acids and ketones, there can be an awkward middle zone. Hunger is still active. Ketones may not yet be fully supporting the brain. The person may be accustomed to eating at regular intervals. Blood sugar may still feel less stable subjectively, even if it is not dangerously low. In that in-between stage, fasting can feel foggy or distracting. This does not necessarily mean the body is failing. It may mean the transition is underway and not yet elegant, but it can still feel unpleasant. People sometimes mistake this transitional discomfort for the whole truth of fasting. They try it once, feel distracted and irritable for several hours, and conclude that the body simply cannot handle it. In some cases, that may indeed be a sign that fasting is not appropriate or not well tolerated in that person's context, but in other cases it may simply reflect unfamiliarity. The body learns patterns. If it is used to regular meals every few hours, changing that rhythm may feel awkward at first. Hunger signals may arrive loudly. The mind may not yet trust the body's reserve systems. With time, some people find that this roughness softens. Others do not. Both outcomes are possible. Adaptation helps, but adaptation is not guaranteed. It is also worth saying that focus itself is not one thing. A person may feel mentally sharp in some ways and worse in others. They may find routine tasks easier and creative work harder. They may enjoy the sense of simplified energy but struggle with social warmth. They may feel alert but not especially flexible. The brain does not just have a single dial-labelled function. It has many modes. Fasting may support a kind of narrow, sustained attention in some people, while reducing comfort, emotional ease, or willingness to improvise. The result can feel like clarity on paper but not necessarily kindness in conversation. That too is part of the experience. Caffeine complicates this picture wonderfully. Many people fast while drinking coffee or tea, especially in the morning, and caffeine can make fasting feel dramatically different. It may suppress appetite, sharpen attention, and increase alertness, making the fast seem easier and more productive. It may also increase anxiety, jitteriness, stomach discomfort, or the sense that you're operating on borrowed confidence and a slightly unstable heartbeat. When people say fasting makes them mentally clear, it is sometimes worth remembering that 3 strong coffees may have been doing a fair bit of the public relations work. The body is rarely responding to fasting alone. It is responding to fasting plus habits, plus caffeine, plus sleep, plus the emotional weather of the day. Hydration is another surprisingly common factor in how fasting feels. If someone is not drinking enough fluids, especially during longer fasting windows, they may develop headaches, fatigue, low mood, or mental fog that they attribute entirely to the absence of food. Sometimes the issue is partly fluid balance or electrolytes. Glycogen is stored with water, and as glycogen is used, water shifts can occur. Sodium intake may also matter, especially during longer fasts or in people who sweat a lot or drink a great deal of plain water. A person may think fasting makes them dull and exhausted when in part they are simply underhydrated and mildly depleted. The body does not appreciate being interpreted through incomplete evidence. Exercise adds another layer. Some people feel good doing light or moderate exercise while fasting. A walk, some easy cycling, gentle movement, even certain kinds of focused work can feel supported by the body's increased access to fatty acids. Others find that demanding exercise while fasting makes them tired, flat, or mentally off, especially if glycogen is low and the activity is intense. This can influence mood for the rest of the day. A hard workout without food may feel energizing to one person and deeply irritating to another. The body's available fuel, training history and stress load all shape whether fasting and exercise become a harmonious pairing or a somewhat petty argument. Mood, meanwhile, is often the most honest part of the experience because it is harder to disguise. Focus can sometimes be forced. Productivity can be faked for a while. Mood tends to reveal whether the body is coping well. Some people feel emotionally steadier while fasting. There is a sense of quiet, perhaps even of mild detachment. Others feel noticeably more fragile, impatient, or preoccupied. If the fast is too long, ill-timed, or layered onto a stressful life, mood often pays the price first. The body begins conserving. The world seems less charming. Food acquires symbolic importance. A bowl of soup starts to look not merely nourishing, but morally correct. That emotional response makes sense. Food is not just energy. It is comfort, routine, pleasure, social rhythm, and grounding. Removing it temporarily can leave a person feeling not only hungry, but slightly dislocated. This is especially true in evenings, when meals often carry more emotional meaning than in the middle of a busy morning. Fasting through an evening can feel harder not simply because of calories, but because dinner often serves as punctuation. It says the day is ending, work is done, now we gather or rest. Without it, some people feel oddly unfinished. Mood is always tied to meaning, and food has plenty of meaning. There is also individual temperament to consider. Some people naturally tolerate bodily discomfort better than others. Some are more reward sensitive, more appetite aware, more emotionally affected by routine changes. Some have histories of dieting or food control that make fasting feel charged rather than neutral. For them, not eating may trigger anxiety, pride, rebellion, or old patterns that have nothing to do with ketones or insulin and everything to do with memory and self-perception. A person with a calm relationship to food may experience fasting as an interesting physiological interval. A person with a strained relationship to food may experience it as a psychologically loaded event. The body is present in both cases, but the mind is not arriving empty-handed. This is why the same fasting window can feel productive one week and awful the next. Perhaps one day you are rested, hydrated, lightly active, and metabolically settled. Fasting feels easy. Your concentration is steady. You rather smugly assume you've discovered a superior way to live. Then a week later you try the same thing after poor sleep, too much work, a stressful conversation, and not enough water. Suddenly you are distracted, impatient, and developing unreasonably detailed fantasies about buttered toast. The protocol has not changed. The organism has. Biology is not built to give identical performances on command. There is something useful in that unpredictability. It reminds us not to turn fasting into mythology. It can support clear energy and focus in some situations, yes. It can also create friction. Both are true because the body is not a slogan. It is a living system responding to context. Fasting is not good because it always feels clear, nor bad because it sometimes feels hard. It is simply a condition that reveals how energy regulation, hormones, mood, and routine intersect in a real person on a real day. For some, the clearest benefit of fasting is not a dramatic surge in focus, but a different relationship to appetite. They discover they can feel hunger without panic. They can work, think, and move while not eating. Food becomes something they choose rather than something that always interrupts. That can feel mentally freeing. For others, the clearest lesson is the opposite. They discover that fasting makes them less kind, less stable, or less effective, and that regular meals support their life better. That too is useful knowledge. Biology is not a moral competition, it is information. By now the pattern should be familiar. Fasting changes fuel use, hormone signals, cellular priorities, and brain energy. Those changes can feel steady or difficult depending on many factors. But there is one more question that naturally follows from this. If fasting can sometimes feel clear and sometimes rough, if it can act as a manageable stress in one body and an unhelpful burden in another, how do we tell the difference between fasting that is adaptive and fasting that is simply too much? Where is the line between useful challenge and strain that begins to push the body farther than it should go? Fasting is often described in glowing terms by people who feel it works well for them. It is called cleansing, clarifying, stabilizing, energizing, simplifying, and sometimes, in the right body under the right conditions, some of those descriptions are fair enough. But there is another side to the story that matters just as much. Fasting is also a stress. Not necessarily a bad one, not necessarily a harmful one, but a stress all the same. It asks the body to function without incoming food for a period of time. It changes hormones. It shifts fuel use. It alters appetite signals. It asks cells, organs, and the brain to adapt. When that adaptation is manageable, fasting can feel like a reset. When it is too much, too frequent, too poorly timed, or layered onto an already strained body, it stops feeling helpful and starts pushing in the wrong direction. This is one of the most important truths about fasting, and also one of the least glamorous. Whether fasting helps or harms depends less on ideology than on context. That word stress can be unhelpful in modern conversation because people often hear it and assume danger. But biologically, stress is not automatically bad. Stress simply means demand. Exercise is stress. Cold exposure is stress. A vaccine is stress. Learning something difficult is stress. Even staying awake through a long workday is stress. The body does not avoid stress entirely, it adapts to it. In fact, much of health depends on the ability to meet manageable stress and recover well afterward. That is why movement makes the body stronger, why muscles grow after being challenged, and why many beneficial processes in biology are triggered not by perfect comfort, but by measured difficulty. Fasting can belong to that category. For some people, for some periods of time, it acts like a mild challenge that the body is perfectly capable of meeting. It nudges fuel systems, improves metabolic flexibility, and creates a useful interval between meals. In that sense, it behaves like a reset. But all beneficial stress depends on dose and recovery. This is where things begin to separate. A brisk walk can be healthy. A sprint on a broken ankle is not. Strength training can be useful. Lifting far beyond your capacity every day without rest is not. In the same way, a modest fasting window in a healthy, well-rested, well-nourished body may be manageable or even beneficial, while prolonged or repeated fasting in a body already under strain may become more burden than benefit. The body does not reward every challenge equally. It asks whether the challenge fits the current condition. One of the clearest signs that fasting is acting more like a reset than a burden is that the body seems able to maintain stability while doing it. Energy remains reasonably steady. Hunger rises in waves but is manageable. Mood does not collapse. Sleep is not badly disturbed. Food is not becoming obsessive. The person can fast and then eat normally later without swinging into chaos, binging, or feeling depleted for hours afterward. Their body seems able to move into the fasted state and back out again with a sense of rhythm. In that case, fasting may be acting as a manageable metabolic demand, one the body can absorb without excessive cost. But when fasting pushes too far, the signs often appear not in grand dramatic failures, but in smaller patterns of strain. Mood worsens, irritability becomes common, sleep becomes lighter or more fragmented. A person who fasts may wake up at odd hours, wired and tired, because the body is pushing stress hormones to keep blood sugar steady through the night. Energy may feel flatter rather than cleaner. Workouts may begin to suffer. Recovery may slow. Cravings may become intense later in the day. Meals after fasting may become chaotic, overly large, or emotionally charged. Thoughts about food may begin taking up more space than seems reasonable. These are not signs of moral weakness. They are signs that the balance may be off. One of the best ways to understand this balance is to think in terms of total load. The body is always carrying some amount of stress load already. Sleep deprivation adds to it. Emotional stress adds to it. Illness adds to it. Hard training adds to it. Undereating adds to it. Parenting, deadlines, grief, travel, hormonal shifts, poor recovery, even prolonged decision fatigue can all make the body less enthusiastic about additional demands. In a low-load state, fasting may be manageable. In a high-load state, the exact same fasting window may be too much. The fasting itself has not changed. The total burden has. This is why timing matters so much. Fasting may be easier and more useful during calm, regular periods of life, and much less appropriate during upheaval. Someone sleeping well, working moderate hours, and eating adequately may tolerate a daily overnight fast or delayed breakfast without much trouble. The same person during intense work stress, after several bad nights of sleep, or while recovering from illness, may find that fasting makes everything worse. The body is simply less willing to take on extra adaptation when it is already busy surviving other things. It is not being dramatic, it is being sensible. Hormones are often where this difference shows up. A manageable fast may lower insulin, support fat mobilization, and allow the body to move into a useful maintenance state without excessive alarm. An excessive fast, or one layered onto an already stressed system, may push cortisol and other stress hormones high enough that the whole experience begins to feel strained. The body works harder to maintain blood sugar. Sleep may suffer. Mood may become sharper in unpleasant ways. The person may feel wired, but not well. There is a difference between alertness and overactivation, and the body knows it even if motivational slogans do not. This matters especially because fasting is sometimes sold as though more is always better. Longer windows, stricter routines, fewer meals, more control, more discipline. But the body rarely treats more as a synonym for better. It treats more as more. More hours without food, more need to mobilize fuel, more need to preserve blood sugar, more need to shift hormones, more need to compensate. If the body can do that and recover well, fine. If not, you begin paying a cost. That cost may not look dramatic at first. It may look like poorer sleep, greater irritability, reduced libido, lower training capacity, irregular cycles in women, or a growing fixation on food that steals attention from the rest of life. The body keeps records in subtle ways before it sends stronger warnings. Women in particular often have to be more cautious with fasting advice that is handed out, as though all bodies are metabolically identical. They are not. Female physiology is responsive not only to food intake and stress, but also to reproductive hormones and energy availability in ways that can make aggressive fasting more disruptive. Menstrual cycles are one of the clearest indicators of whether the body feels safe and sufficiently supported. If fasting is too frequent, too long, or combined with too little overall intake and too much stress, the reproductive system may begin adjusting. Cycles can become irregular, symptoms can worsen. That does not mean women cannot fast. Many do perfectly well with modest fasting windows. It means the body is paying attention to the whole energy picture, not just whether ketones are impressive today. Athletes and highly active people are another group where fasting can easily tip from useful to counterproductive. Training is already a form of stress. It uses glycogen, raises inflammation temporarily, challenges tissues, and requires recovery. If fasting is added without regard to total energy needs, the person may begin under-recovering. Performance can drop, strength may stagnate, mood can sour, sleep can become less restorative. The body may start preserving rather than adapting. In some low-intensity or carefully timed cases, fasting and training can coexist well, but it takes thought. A person doing long-endurance sessions, repeated hard workouts, or physically demanding work may simply need more regular fueling than fasting culture likes to admit. The body is not interested in whether the routine sounds admirable online. It is interested in whether it can keep repairing tissue and meeting demand. There is also the issue of energy availability over the course of days and weeks, not just hours. A person may technically do fine during a daily fast, but still end up under-eating overall if the eating window becomes too narrow or too chaotic. This can happen gradually and quietly. At first, they feel in control. Meals are compressed. Appetite perhaps seems manageable. Then over time, they begin feeling colder, flatter, more tired, more reactive. Exercise becomes harder. Sleep changes. Hair or skin may show subtle signs of lower intake. Recovery from daily life takes longer. The person may not connect this to fasting because the fast itself feels tolerable enough, but the total pattern matters. The body does not only care whether you made it to lunch, it cares whether enough nutrients and energy are consistently arriving to support the whole system. This is especially important because appetite can become a confusing guide under repeated stress. Some people assume that if fasting were too much, they would simply feel overwhelmingly hungry. But the body is not always that straightforward. Appetite can become blunted under stress. A person may stop feeling strong hunger cues and interpret that as adaptation when, in some cases, it is partly suppression. Stress hormones can dull appetite temporarily. Habit can silence signals. The absence of loud hunger does not always mean the body is thriving. Sometimes it just means the body is reorganized around not expecting food at certain times. Again, context decides whether that reorganization is healthy or costly. A useful reset usually has a certain softness to it. The body seems to cooperate. Hunger is present but not hostile. Mood is mostly stable. Food remains enjoyable when it comes. Meals do not turn into frantic compensation. Sleep stays decent. Life still fits around the fast rather than the fast beginning to dominate life. When fasting helps, it often feels almost boring in the best way. It becomes a simple structure, not a drama. The body knows what to do. The person knows when to eat. There is no moral spectacle around it. It simply works as one rhythm among others. When fasting pushes too far, it often becomes louder in the mind. Food occupies more thought. The person may become rigid, defensive, or proud in a way that suggests the routine has become more identity than tool. Breaks in the fast may feel upsetting rather than ordinary. Social meals become difficult not because of biology alone, but because the fasting pattern has become emotionally charged. This is an important warning sign, especially for anyone with a history of disordered eating. Fasting can be used in ways that look like discipline from the outside, but function more like control, avoidance, or self-punishment from the inside. The body can adapt to that for a while, but adaptation does not equal health. There is a particularly subtle trap here for people who like structure. Fasting can feel clean, it removes decisions, it can produce a satisfying sense of order. For some, this is helpful. For others, especially those prone to rigidity or anxiety around food, it can become too attractive for the wrong reasons. The fast begins not as a flexible tool, but as a rule that must not be broken. Meals become transactions rather than nourishment. Hunger becomes something to conquer rather than understand. At that point, even if the metabolism looks functional on the surface, the overall relationship to food may be moving in an unhealthy direction. The body is never just chemistry. The mind matters too. That does not mean fasting must be avoided by everyone who likes routine. It means the test is not merely whether you can do it. The test is whether it leaves you healthier, steadier, and more flexible or more strained, preoccupied and rigid. A good tool should make life simpler. If fasting begins making life smaller, more anxious, or more food-obsessed, something is probably off. The point of understanding biology is not to create more elegant forms of suffering. It is to work with the body rather than against it. It is also worth remembering that the body's needs change over time. A fasting pattern that feels fine in one season of life may feel awful in another. Stress changes, training changes, hormones change, work changes. Parenthood changes everything from sleep to meal timing to the ability to finish a cup of tea while it is still recognizably hot. Illness, travel, aging, and emotional burden all change the body's willingness to be challenged. This is why a rigid once-and-for-all answer rarely works. The body is not a machine following one ideal schedule forever. It is a living system that needs responsiveness. One of the clearest examples of this responsiveness is sleep. If fasting consistently disrupts sleep, that is a serious clue. Sleep is too central to recovery, hormone balance, immune function, mood, and metabolic health to be traded casually for a fasting schedule that looks efficient on paper. Some people sleep perfectly well during modest fasting windows. Others begin waking early, waking hungry, or feeling more alert at night in a way that is not restful. Sometimes this reflects stress hormones helping maintain blood sugar through a longer fast. Sometimes it reflects undereating in general. Either way, if a person is sacrificing good sleep to preserve a fasting routine, the routine may no longer be serving the larger goal of health. The same is true of mood. Occasional hunger-related irritability is one thing. A steady lowering of emotional resilience is another. If fasting makes a person less patient, more anxious, more brittle, or more fixated, that cost matters. Health is not merely the absence of breakfast. It includes the quality of your relationships, your attention, your ability to recover, your emotional steadiness, and your sense of ease in daily life. A fasting pattern that improves one biomarker while making you impossible to live with is perhaps not the triumph it first appears to be. There is also the question of whether fasting is actually helping the problem a person hopes it will solve. Sometimes it truly does help with appetite regulation, meal structure, metabolic flexibility, or reducing mindless grazing. In those cases, it can be a useful tool. But sometimes fasting is used to solve a problem created by other issues. A person is sleeping badly, stressed, over-caffeinated and under-recovered, yet fasting is expected to somehow reset everything. That is a lot to ask of meal timing. If the deeper problem is poor sleep, chronic overwhelm, or inadequate overall nutrition, fasting may not reset anything. It may simply add one more moving part to an already unstable system. This is why a helpful fast often lives inside a bigger picture of sufficiency. The person eats enough overall. Their meals are reasonably nourishing. Sleep is acceptable. Stress is not perfect, because nothing human is, but not overwhelming all the time. The fasting interval then becomes just one part of a supportive rhythm. In contrast, a harmful fasting pattern often lives inside scarcity. Not enough food overall, too much pressure, too little recovery, too much identity attached to being good with food. In that environment, fasting stops being a reset and becomes another way the body is asked to do more with less. There is a quiet wisdom in learning to tell the difference. The body usually gives clues. Helpful fasting tends to leave you feeling more stable, not less. More free, not more obsessed. Better recovered, not more depleted. Able to eat normally later, not driven into extremes. In contrast, unhelpful fasting tends to leave traces of strain. Sleep worsens, mood worsens, cravings intensify, recovery declines, the routine becomes rigid. Food acquires too much emotional charge. Energy feels borrowed rather than steady. The body is not subtle forever. And perhaps the most honest way to think about it is this. Fasting helps when the body experiences it as a manageable interval. It pushes too far when the body experiences it as scarcity layered onto strain. The outside schedule may look identical in both cases. A 16-hour fast can be fine in one person and too much in another. The difference lies not in the number alone, but in the context surrounding it. Biology always asks, manageable for whom, on what day, in what life? That question matters because the goal is not merely to endure fasting. The goal, if there is one, is to work with the body in a way that supports health over time. Sometimes that means a modest fasting rhythm fits beautifully. Sometimes it means breakfast is exactly the wiser choice. The body is not judging either option. It is reading conditions and responding. And when we listen carefully enough, it often becomes clear that the most useful thing is not to force one ideal pattern, but to understand what the body's actually asking for. That understanding brings us quietly to the final thought in this long evening journey. Because beyond glucose and glycogen, beyond hormones and ketones, beyond hunger waves, mood shifts and cellular maintenance, fasting leaves us with a simpler question. What does it really mean for a creature like us to eat, to pause, and to begin again in rhythm rather than fear? Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight we arrive at the quiet end of our journey through fasting, though perhaps not an ending in the strict sense, more a resting place, a softer part of the path. We have followed the body through the first hours without food, through glycogen and glucose, through shifting hormones and rising ketones, through hunger waves, cellular housekeeping, and the strange fact that not eating for a while can feel either surprisingly steady or surprisingly difficult depending on the body, the day, and the life surrounding it. And now, after all that chemistry and adaptation, what remains is a simpler question. What does it really mean to eat, to pause, and to begin again? Before we settle into that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. It feels fitting somehow because so much of this story has really been about time. The time between meals, the time the body needs to shift, the time it takes to feel hunger and watch it pass, the time needed for rest, repair, and return. And if this quiet exploration has brought you some calm, some interest, or simply a gentler landing at the end of the day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this sleepy little corner reach more people who enjoy winding down with a bit of biology before rest. Now get comfortable, let your thoughts loosen a little, and let us finish not with a rule, but with a reflection. Fasting, when stripped of all the slogans and arguments and dramatic promises, returns us to something very basic. A living body eats, then it does not eat, then it eats again. That rhythm is older than health trends, older than calorie charts, older than metabolism podcasts, older even than the strange modern belief that every sensation of appetite requires immediate diplomatic intervention. Long before food could be ordered by tapping a screen, long before there were shelves lit at midnight, and snacks engineered to be impossible to stop eating, bodies were already moving through this cycle. Nourishment, pause, nourishment again. The body is built not only to receive, but also to wait, not only to store, but also to use, not only to take in, but also to turn inward for a while and manage what it has. There is something deeply reassuring in that. Much of modern life encourages the feeling that the body is fragile, overreactive, forever on the brink of some small collapse if breakfast is slightly delayed or lunch happens later than expected. But the body, as we have seen, is more capable than that. It can handle intervals, it can shift from feeding to fasting and back again. It can release stored energy, protect the brain, recycle old cellular parts, adjust hormones, and keep the whole operation going with a quiet competence that would be impressive enough even if it did not also have to carry around our anxieties, our routines, our social lives, and our emotional attachment to biscuits. And yet competence is not the same as indifference. The body can handle a pause, but it still cares deeply about being nourished. This matters. Sometimes people speak of fasting as though it reveals food to be unnecessary, or as though the highest goal is to become so efficient that eating itself starts to seem like a weakness. But that is not what the biology says. The biology says something gentler and far more balanced. It says the body needs both. It needs feeding and fasting, input and interval, building and recycling, rest and activity, growth and maintenance. To eat is not failure. To pause is not failure either. Health is not found in choosing one side forever. It is found in rhythm. That rhythm may look different for different people, which is another truth worth holding on to. Not everyone needs the same meal timing. Not everyone feels good with the same fasting window. Some people wake hungry and truly do better with breakfast. Some feel perfectly well waiting until later. Some find that regular eating supports mood, training, and energy beautifully. Others feel steadier with longer gaps between meals. Some move easily through fasting. Others become anxious, flat, or irritable in ways that simply are not worth pretending are somehow noble. The body is not a competition. It is not a moral exam. It is not awarding medals for the number of hours one can ignore a sandwich. It is asking a much simpler question. Under these conditions, what helps me function, recover, think, sleep, and live well? This question has a way of cutting through a lot of noise. Fasting can be useful, yes, but useful is not the same as universally superior. If a fasting pattern helps a person feel less chaotic around food, more metabolically steady, less inclined to graze mindlessly all day, and still leaves them well rested and well fed overall, then perhaps it is serving them. If the same pattern leaves them obsessed with food, sharp in mood, disrupted in sleep, cold, depleted, or strangely proud of suffering in a way that makes ordinary dinner invitations feel like ethical dilemmas, then perhaps it is not. The body tends to be remarkably honest when we stop trying to force it into somebody else's ideal. There is also something humbling about recognizing how much of eating is more than fuel. Food is chemistry, certainly. We have spent many hours together following glucose, insulin, glycogen, fatty acids, ketones, ghrelin, cortisol, autophagy, and all the rest. But food is also one of the main ways human life becomes patterned and shared. Breakfast marks a beginning. Lunch interrupts work. Dinner closes distance between people, even when the distance is only between you and your own exhausted self standing in the kitchen with a spoon. Meals are social, they're cultural, they're emotional. They're woven into memory so tightly that the smell of a certain soup can collapse time more effectively than philosophy ever could. To pause from eating for a while may reveal something useful about the body. To return to eating reveals something useful about being human. This is perhaps why fasting can feel so revealing even when it is simple. In the pause, you begin to notice things. You notice when hunger arrives. You notice whether it rises like panic or passes like weather. You notice how often appetite is really habit. You notice how much of eating is driven by time, smell, boredom, reward or comfort, rather than immediate energy need. You notice the body's cleverness. You notice the mind's impatience. You notice whether food has become something you enjoy or something you negotiate with. In a way, fasting is not just a metabolic event. It is an interruption in the usual script, and whenever a script is interrupted, the hidden lines become easier to hear. But the return matters as much as the pause. There is a subtle danger in admiring fasting so much that one begins to treat eating as an unfortunate lapse in discipline. The body does not see it that way. Eating is how glycogen is restored. It is how protein supports tissue repair. It is how micronutrients arrive. It is how muscles recover. It is how the immune system is supplied. It is how the brain is reassured over the long term that resources are available. It is how life remains more than a prolonged exercise in internal resource management. The pause may be useful, but nourishment is still the larger promise. The body does not want to live forever in emergency planning mode, no matter how elegantly it can manage there. That is why the phrase begin again feels so important. After a fast, the body begins again. It receives food, insulin rises, glycogen can be replenished, the digestive tract resumes its steady work, nutrients move into tissues, building becomes possible again. The body shifts from drawing inward to receiving outward. It is not a betrayal of the fast, it is the completion of the cycle. There is something very kind in seeing it that way. The pause was not an act of punishment. The meal is not an act of weakness. They belong to one another. The body pauses so it can manage. The body eats so it can continue. This idea of beginning again is, I think, one of the gentlest lessons in all of physiology. Bodies are always beginning again. Sleep ends and waking begins. Muscles are challenged and then repaired. Skin sheds and renews. Blood cells are replaced. Memories are laid down and revised. Cells clear damaged parts and make new ones. The whole organism is a rhythm of turnover, not a monument carved once and left unchanged. Feeding and fasting fit into that larger pattern. They are not opposites in conflict. They are movements in sequence. One opens the hand, the other closes it. One brings things in, the other sorts what is already there. Then the hand opens again. Perhaps this is why strict moral language around food and fasting so often feels wrong. It tries to turn rhythm into righteousness. It treats one half of the cycle as virtue and the other as temptation. But the body has no such interest. It does not call hunger a sin. It does not call a meal a reward in the moral sense. It simply responds. It uses. It stores. It releases. It repairs. It asks for enough. It asks for timing that fits the larger life around it. It asks, quietly but repeatedly, not to be confused with ideology. This is especially worth remembering because so many people come to fasting not from calm curiosity, but from fear. Fear of weight gain. Fear of being out of control around food. Fear of illness. Fear of hunger itself. Fear of having done eating wrong. In that emotional climate, fasting can easily become less a biological tool and more a gesture of self-correction, an attempt to restore order through control. Sometimes that works for a while, at least on the surface. But the body notices the spirit in which it is being treated. A pause chosen from curiosity and used with insufficiency is one thing. A pause driven by fear and layered onto deprivation is another. The physiology may overlap, but the experience and the consequences can be very different. There is a softness available here that often gets lost. You can understand fasting without worshipping it. You can respect the body's ability to pause without forcing that pause when the body's already tired. You can enjoy a meal without treating it like failure. You can notice hunger without obeying it instantly, and also without making a grand identity out of resisting it. You can begin again in a way that is ordinary rather than dramatic. That kind of ordinariness is deeply underrated. The body thrives on rhythms that are steady enough to trust and flexible enough to live with. Flexibility may be the real hidden gift in all of this. Not fasting itself exactly, but the flexibility it reveals when things are going well. A flexible metabolism can eat and pause. A flexible mind can feel hunger without panic, and can also eat without guilt. A flexible routine can hold structure without becoming prison. A flexible person can notice that what felt right in one season of life does not feel right in another, and make changes without feeling they have failed some secret test. This kind of flexibility is much closer to health than any rigid fasting schedule could ever be on its own. There is also something almost philosophical, though I shall try not to become too dreamy at this hour, in the fact that the body survives not by clinging only to abundance or only to restraint, but by moving between them. Too much constant intake, and there is no interval for certain forms of maintenance. Too much constant deprivation, and there is no replenishment, no building, no ease. Life depends on oscillation. Heartbeats contract and release. Breathing inhales and exhales. Sleep cycles dip and rise. Hormones pulse. Nerves fire and reset. Feeding and fasting join a long list of paired movements without which living systems lose their grace. And perhaps that is why so much confusion arises when people try to freeze one useful state and live there permanently. The fed state has its gifts, but not forever. The fasted state has its gifts, but not forever either. The body was not built for permanent brunch, nor was it built for endless abstinence. It was built for change. It was built for sequence. It was built to respond to what comes and what does not come, and to keep going through both. The intelligence of the body lies not in choosing one state as pure, but in navigating transitions. Transitions, of course, are where many of us struggle most. We're often much better at all or nothing than at rhythm. Eat constantly or cut back severely. Follow the plan or abandon it entirely. Be good or off track. But the body does not live well in that language. It lives better in something more forgiving. It eats, then pauses, then eats again. A day goes well, then less well, then well enough again. One season invites more structure, another more support. The point is not perfection. The point is return, begin again. Not because yesterday was wrong, but because today is here. This return is beautifully ordinary. It may be breakfast after an overnight fast. It may be soup after a long day. It may be a quiet meal eaten without urgency. It may be the body receiving food after having used what it stored, and finding once again that the cycle still works. There is comfort in that. The body pauses and does not fall apart. The body eats and does not become morally compromised. The system continues. A little glycogen is restored. Hormones change tone. Hunger eases. The brain softens. The day moves on. Perhaps the gentlest conclusion is that fasting, properly understood, is not mainly about proving strength. It is about seeing the body more clearly, seeing how prepared it is, seeing how it responds to absence, seeing where it is resilient and where it is sensitive, seeing how much hunger is biology and how much it is pattern, seeing how food is both fuel and meaning, seeing that the body does not need constant interference to be wise. It needs listening. It needs enough. It needs rhythm. It needs a life around it that allows both pause and nourishment to make sense. And now, having gone through all of this together, it may be enough simply to rest with that image. A body that eats, pauses, and begins again. A body that is always adjusting, never static, never as simple as a slogan. A body that can draw on stores when food is absent and then welcome food when it returns. A body that knows how to clean, rebuild, release, replenish, and continue. Not perfectly, not infinitely, not without context or care, but with a kind of everyday intelligence that is easy to overlook when we're busy judging it. So wherever you are tonight, however your own rhythms have looked lately, whether your days have felt steady or scrambled, whether food has been simple or complicated, whether your body has felt easy to live in or slightly difficult to interpret, I hope this quiet journey through fasting has left you with something gentler than a rule. Perhaps just a little more trust, a little more curiosity, a little less drama around the spaces between meals. The body does not need us to turn every pause into a philosophy. It only asks, as ever, for enough care to recognize when the pause is useful, when the meal is needed, and when it is time, very simply, to begin again. And if your thoughts are growing softer now, if the day is settling and your mind is beginning to loosen its grip, then perhaps this is a good place to leave things for tonight. Not with a grand answer, but with the quiet sense that beneath all the noise of advice and arguments, your body is still doing what bodies have always done. It takes in, it lets go, it waits, it uses, it restores, it begins again. And somewhere in that slow rhythm between hunger and nourishment, effort and ease, the next gentle question is already beginning to form.